Calvin Reddick didn't whisper it. He said it loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Look at her." He stood on the steps of his hotel, thumbs hooked in his vest, and he laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from a man who has never once been told no. "You're going to cook? Here? In my town?" Eliza Whitmore stood in the mud with her travel bag and her mother's skillet, and she did not look away. "That kitchen behind the barn," Calvin said, still grinning. "It's yours, no charge." He spread his arms wide for the crowd gathering on the boardwalk. "Let's give the big lady a chance, shall we?" The laughter that followed was the kind that sticks to your skin. If that were you standing there, every eye on you, every mouth curled, what would you do? Would you walk away? Or would you pick up that skillet and get to work? If this story already has you, hit that subscribe button and follow Eliza's journey all the way to the end. Every week we bring you stories that will shake you, move you, and remind you what people are truly made of, like this video, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Part 1. The stagecoach had been late by 4 hours, which meant Eliza arrived in Hollow Fork at dusk instead of midday, which meant that when she stepped down onto the main street with her single bag and her skillet wrapped in an old flour sack, the first people to see her were the ones who had nothing better to do than stand around and watch a stranger arrive. She felt their eyes before she saw their faces. Hollow Fork was not the town she had imagined from the letter. The letter, written in a neat hand by a man named Gerald Pruitt, who ran the general store, had described a growing settlement, a community in need of good food and willing workers. It had described opportunity. What Eliza saw instead was a main street caked in mid-October mud, a row of buildings that leaned slightly into each other like tired men at the end of a long shift, and a sky the color of a bruise spreading west toward the mountains. She had not come here because she had choices. She had come here because she had none. The last 2 years had taken nearly everything. First, the boarding house in Cheyenne, where she had worked as a cook, closed when the owner's son gambled away the property deed in a single night of bad cards. Then the 6 months she spent cooking for a trail outfit, until the outfit boss decided a woman of her size was bad for morale, which was his way of saying he didn't like that his men respected her more than they respected him. Then Cheyenne itself, which had grown expensive and cold in ways that had nothing to do with weather. She was 32 years old and she had a canvas bag with 2 dresses, 1 pair of boots with a crack in the left sole, 43 cents, and her mother's cast iron skillet. The skillet was heavier than everything else combined. She had considered leaving it behind 3 separate times and had not been able to do it. Her mother had cooked 1,000 meals in that skillet. Eliza believed, in the way people believe things they can't quite explain, that the skillet remembered every one of them. Gerald Pruitt met her at the edge of the street. He was a small, apologetic-looking man with a thin beard and the particular expression of someone who has just remembered a promise they wish they hadn't made. "Miss Whitmore," he said, shaking her hand quickly, "glad you made it safe." "Thank you for writing," she said. He nodded. His eyes moved briefly to her figure, that flicker that she had learned to catch, the fraction of a second when people recalculated. And then he looked somewhere past her left shoulder. "I should tell you," he said, "that the situation here is a little more... That is, there's been some changes since I wrote to you." "What kind of changes?" "Well," he cleared his throat, "the kitchen space I mentioned, the one attached to the back of the freight barn. It's available, still available, but there's been some discussion about it." "What kind of discussion?" Before Gerald could answer, the answer walked across the street toward them. Calvin Reddick was not a large man physically. He was medium height, maybe 40 years old, with a face that had once been handsome and now wore its confidence the way some men wear an expensive coat, meant to be noticed, meant to communicate something. He owned the Reddick Hotel, which was the largest building on the main street, 3 stories of wood and ambition, with real glass windows and a dining room that served the only hot meals in Hollow Fork. He also owned, as Eliza would later learn, the livery stable, 2 of the 4 lots on the north end of town, and a controlling interest in the freight company that operated out of the barn she was currently standing next to. He had not come across the street to welcome her. "This the woman from Cheyenne?" he said to Gerald, as if Eliza were not standing 3 feet away. "This is Miss Eliza Whitmore," Gerald said carefully. "She's the cook I told you about." Calvin looked at her then. Actually looked at her. and she watched his face move through something she had seen before. Amusement. The easy, careless amusement of a man who has already decided the outcome of something and is simply enjoying the confirmation. "You're going to cook," he said. Not a question. A statement delivered for an audience, and there was one forming: two men outside the livery, a woman in a doorway, a kid perched on a fence post. "That's right," Eliza said. "Here, in this town, in that kitchen." He gestured toward the side of the barn without looking at it. "That's what I understand." He laughed then. That big public laugh she would come to know well. He turned to include the street in it, opening his arms slightly, like a man presenting something to an audience that had gathered specifically to see it. "Well," he said, loud enough for all of them, "let's give the big lady a chance, shall we? No charge on the space, no charge at all." He looked back at her, and the amusement in his face had settled into something harder and more deliberate. "Let's see what you can do." The laughter from the onlookers was not cruel exactly. It was the laughter of people who have decided something is not serious enough to require cruelty, the laughter you give a child who claims they can lift something heavy. Light, dismissive, gone in seconds. Eliza stood in the mud and held her bag and her skillet and let it wash over her. She did not say anything. She had learned over the years that silence at the right moment costs nothing and communicates more than any argument. Calvin waited, perhaps expecting a protest, perhaps expecting tears. When neither came, something shifted briefly in his expression, something like surprise, smoothed over almost immediately by satisfaction. He touched the brim of his hat. "Good evening, Miss Whitmore." And he walked back across the street to his hotel. Gerald Pruitt watched him go. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. He has opinions about most things." "Show me the kitchen," Eliza said. It was worse than she'd expected and not as bad as it could have been. The kitchen was a single room added onto the back of the freight barn, clearly built as an afterthought and abandoned with equal thoughtlessness. One window, cracked clean across, packed with old rags to keep out the wind. A door that was mostly missing, two broken hinges, and about a third of the actual door remained. The rest of it having been removed at some point for purposes Eliza chose not to speculate about. A plank floor with gaps between the boards wide enough to see dirt below. And a stove. The stove was the thing she looked at longest. It was a cast iron range, older than she was, with rust along both sides of the firebox and a top plate that had cracked and been inexpertly repaired with what appeared to be some kind of dried clay compound. One of the legs had been replaced with a stack of flat stones. She crouched down and opened the firebox door. It groaned. She looked inside, then closed it again. "The damper still works," Gerald said from the doorway. He sounded like a man defending a house he knew he'd oversold. "I checked it last month." "The leg," Eliza said, pointing at the stones. "Stable enough, more or less." She stood up. Her knees ached. They had been aching more in the cold lately, something she tried not to think about, and she put one hand flat on the top of the stove and pressed. It didn't move. "More or less will do," she said. Gerald looked relieved in a way that suggested he'd been prepared for something worse. He showed her where the water barrel was, around the outside of the barn, and explained that the freight company would not object to her using the side entrance, and that there was a woodpile she could draw from as long as she replenished it. He named a monthly sum for the space that was low enough to confirm that Calvin's public offer of no charge had been theater. Of course there was a charge, there was always a charge, but manageable if she brought in customers. "There's not much custom here for food," he admitted. "People mostly cook for themselves or eat at the hotel." "The hotel's food is serviceable," which, from the expression on his face as he said it, meant it was not good. Eliza filed this away. After Gerald left, she stood alone in the broken room with the remains of the daylight coming through the cracked window and the rag-stuffed gap, and she did what she always did when she was in a new place and needed to understand it. She stood very still and paid attention. The cold was coming through every gap in the wall, not dramatically but persistently, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself and simply accumulates until you realize your hands have stopped working properly. The stove would be the first priority. Without heat, nothing else was possible. She had a small amount of kindling in her bag, a habit from years of traveling. You always carried something to make fire, and she found a few scraps of wood on the floor that the previous occupants had left behind. She got the stove lit. It smoked badly for the first several minutes, enough to make her eyes water, and then the flue cleared and the heat began to move into the room. The cracked top plate glowed unevenly, but held. The stone-propped leg stayed where it was. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, the skillet in her lap, and she ate the last of the hard biscuit she'd been carrying since Laramie, and she thought about what she had and what she needed. What she had, the stove, the water barrel, 43 cents, which would buy her some basics at Gerald's store if she was careful. Years of knowing how to make something from almost nothing, a skill she had developed not from talent alone but from necessity. Her mother's kitchen had always been a place where the ingredients were few and the people to feed were many, and you learned early that the difference between a meal and a disappointment was almost always imagination. What she needed, everything else. She slept that night on the floor with her coat on, her bag under her head, the stove banked low to last through the dark hours. The cold woke her twice. She added wood both times and went back to sleep. The blacksmith's shop was at the far end of the main street, and she found it the next morning by following the sound of hammer on iron. His name was Elias Boone, and he was perhaps 45, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from wood, and a way of looking at her, or rather of not quite looking at her, that she recognized as shyness rather than dismissal. He was a big man, not fat, but built the way men get who do physical labor for decades, with shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway of the shop and a jaw that could have been used to set fence posts. He didn't look up from the hinge he was working when she came to the doorway. "I heard you came in last night," he said. "News travels fast. Small town." He turned the hinge, examined it, set it back on the anvil. "What do you need?" She told him about the stove, the cracked top plate, the leaking firebox seam, the question of whether the whole thing was worth repairing or whether she should be looking for something else. Though she had no money for something else, she said this plainly, without embarrassment, because embarrassment about money was a luxury she couldn't afford. Elias Boone listened without interrupting. When she was done, he set down his hammer. "I can look at it," he said. "What would you charge?" He thought about this in a way that suggested he was actually thinking about it, not performing consideration. "Depends what it needs. Come back this afternoon and I'll tell you." She thanked him and left, and he watched her go from the corner of his eye, not in the way Calvin Reddick had watched her, but in the way of a man who is slightly puzzled by something and hasn't decided yet how puzzled to be. By mid-morning, she had been to Gerald's store, spent 31 of her 43 cents on flour, lard, salt, 3 eggs, and a small quantity of dried beans, and returned to the kitchen with everything in her bag. 2 of the freight workers found her there when they came through the barn on their way to load a wagon. They stopped at the broken doorway and looked in at her, the way people look at something unexpected. "You the woman from last night?" one of them asked. He was young, maybe 22, with a red scarf around his neck and the general appearance of someone who had been outside in the cold for too long. "I'm Eliza Whitmore," she said. She was building the fire back up, feeding it carefully, the way you have to with a stove you don't know yet. "Harding said you were going to cook here." "That's right." The 2 of them looked at each other. The second one, older, quieter, said, "Nothing personal, but there isn't much here to cook with." "There's enough," Eliza said. "Enough for what?" "Enough for biscuits. You want some?" Another look between them. "We've got to load that wagon by noon." "Biscuits don't take long," she said. They waited. She wasn't sure why, perhaps boredom, perhaps something about her manner that didn't invite doubt. But they leaned against the barn wall outside the broken doorway and waited. And 25 minutes later, she brought them each 2 biscuits wrapped in a piece of cloth she'd torn from the bottom of her spare dress. The young one bit into his and stopped moving entirely for a moment. Just stopped. "That's—" He looked at the biscuit. "How did you do that?" "Salt," she said. "People always use too little." He nodded very slowly, still chewing, with the expression of someone who has just learned something they can't quite articulate. The older freight worker finished his first biscuit without speaking, which was, Eliza had learned, the better compliment. "We'll tell the others," he said, as they went back to work. She went back inside and sat on the floor and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something that felt like hope. Then she got up and started figuring out what she was going to do about the window. Elias Boone came to look at the stove that afternoon. He spent a long time crouched beside it, running his hands along the seams of the firebox, testing the top plate by pressing carefully in several places, examining the clay repair work with the expression of a man who had seen worse but was too honest to say so. "The crack in the top plate," he said finally, "can be managed. Won't be pretty, but it'll hold heat. The firebox seam is the real problem. There's a gap here." He pointed. "That'll let your heat out and pull smoke back in. You'll cook everything with an undertone of ash if we don't fix it." "Can you fix it?" "I can fix it." He paused. "The door for this place too?" "The barn door, what's left of it?" "I can make something, nothing fancy, but something that closes." "What would you want for all of it?" He sat back on his heels and looked at the room. The cracked window, the cold coming through the walls, the flour sack on the floor where she was keeping her supplies. He looked at the stove. "Meals," he said. "Say, 10 meals, worth of credit." She looked at him. "You want to be paid in food?" "I eat at the hotel now." He said it the way Gerald had said serviceable, with a meaning buried underneath the words. "I'd rather not." She put out her hand. He shook it, once, and stood up with some difficulty. His right knee, she noticed, gave him a moment of trouble, though he covered it smoothly. "I'll start tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll have biscuits." Something moved briefly in his face, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "That'll do," he said, and left. She lay awake that night longer than she wanted to, the cold working at the edges of the room despite the stove, and she thought about Calvin Reddick. Not with anger. Anger was something she couldn't afford to maintain. It burned fuel she didn't have. But with clarity. She had dealt with men like him before. Men who looked at her size and calculated weakness. Men who thought that the worst thing you could do to a person was publicly diminish them and then offer them a consolation prize. The kitchen, offered with laughter, was meant to be a joke. She understood that. What Calvin had not considered, what people like Calvin never seemed to consider, was that she had heard every variation of that laugh before. She had been hearing it since she was a girl of 12, standing in a church social with a plate of food she'd made herself, while adults spoke over her head about how it was too bad, really, about the Whitmore girl, so much in the kitchen and not enough of it showing in the right places. She had been underestimated her entire life. It was not a new condition. It was almost a comfortable one, in a dark sort of way, because it meant no one was watching too closely. And if no one was watching too closely, she could work. She was very good at working when no one was watching. She pulled her coat tighter and closed her eyes and listened to the wind find the places in the walls she hadn't plugged yet. And she made a list in her mind of everything she still needed to do. The list was long. The list was, in fact, somewhat alarming in its length. But it had an order to it, a sequence, and sequences were manageable. One thing at a time, one meal at a time. She had started with biscuits. The biscuits had worked. Tomorrow, there would be more. And the day after that, something else. And eventually there would be a door that closed and a window that didn't let in the Wyoming sky. And meals that people would ride miles to eat. She believed this not because she was an optimist. She had never particularly been an optimist. She believed it because she had done it before, in worse kitchens, with fewer ingredients, for harder crowds. She was Eliza Whitmore, and she knew how to cook, and that was in the end going to be enough. The stove ticked and settled in the cold. Outside, somewhere down the street, a door banged open and shut. A horse made a sound of protest at something. Hollow Fork was quiet and dark and indifferent, the way frontier towns always were at night when the business of the day was done and nothing had been decided yet about tomorrow. Eliza breathed slowly and let herself drift toward sleep and thought about what she was going to do with the beans. The beans had been soaking since before dawn. Eliza had put them in the pot the night before with what she calculated was exactly the right amount of water. Not too much, which made them bland, not too little, which made them uneven. And by the time the first gray light started coming through the cracked window, the kitchen smelled like something that had decided to become food. She had been up since 4:30, not because she'd planned to be, but because the cold had a way of making sleep feel dishonest. Past a certain hour, like lying in bed was a conversation you were having with yourself about how comfortable things were when they clearly weren't. She'd added wood to the stove, watched the fire catch, and then sat on the floor with her knees pulled up and thought about the day. Elias Boone arrived at first light carrying a canvas roll of tools and a piece of iron plate roughly the size of a dinner tray. He came around the back of the freight barn, the way a man comes to a place he's been before, without ceremony, and ducked through the broken doorway and looked at the stove like it was an old argument he was ready to finish. "Biscuits," Eliza said, and handed him two wrapped in cloth. He took them, ate the first one standing up, looking at the firebox seam, ate the second one more slowly, turning the iron plate over in his other hand. "You put something in these," he said, "rendered lard instead of straight shortening, and I let the dough rest." He nodded, the way men nod when they understand something technically, but were not previously aware it was a thing to understand. He set down the cloth and crouched beside the stove. They worked in the same space for the better part of 3 hours. Elias with his tools and his iron, and the particular focused silence of a man who knows what he's doing, Eliza around him and past him, tending the beans, mixing a second batch of biscuit dough, inventorying her supplies against the list she kept in her head. They did not talk much. She had noticed the previous afternoon that Elias Boone was not a man who filled silence with noise, and she found this restful in a way she couldn't quite articulate, because most of her life had been spent in kitchens where everyone wanted something from her and said so at length. At one point he asked her to hold a piece of iron in place while he worked a seam, and she did, and he said good, and hold it there, and okay. And that was the whole of it, and the seam was solid when he was done. The freight workers started coming through around 7. Word traveled in the way word travels in small places. Not announced but somehow already known, the way weather moves ahead of itself. The young one with the red scarf, whose name turned out to be Pete Garland, appeared in the doorway with 2 other men behind him. "Is it too early?" he asked. "Sit down," Eliza said. She didn't have chairs. She had 2 sections of plank she'd found against the side of the barn and arranged on empty barrels, and 3 old wooden crates she'd turned upside down. It looked exactly like what it was. Pete Garland sat on a crate without comment. The 2 men behind him, a heavy-set man named Doyle and a thin, sun-darkened man who introduced himself only as Cruz, sat on the planks. Elias Boone kept working at the stove, which meant there were now 4 people in a room barely large enough for 2, and the heat from the stove was making the space feel almost warm, which after 2 nights of cold was something close to remarkable. She served beans with salt pork and biscuits and a thin gravy she'd made from the pork drippings. It was not an elaborate meal. It was the kind of food that existed specifically for people who had been working in cold air since before the sun came up, which meant it was exactly right. Doyle ate without speaking, which she was beginning to understand was his way of showing respect. Pete Garland finished his beans and looked up. "How much?" he asked. She named a price that was fair. Lower than the hotel, higher than nothing. Pete nodded and put the coins on the plank without argument. Doyle and Cruz did the same. "We'll be back tomorrow," Pete said. "I'll be here," she said. After they left, Elias Boone straightened from the stove and put his hands on his lower back and pressed, which was what men his age did when they'd been crouched too long and didn't want to make a production of it. "Seems solid," he said. "Top plate tomorrow. The door I'll bring the day after." "Thank you." He looked at the empty planks where the freight workers had been sitting. "They'll tell the others," he said. It wasn't encouragement exactly. It was more like a report on conditions. "There's another crew comes through Thursday from Rollins' direction. 8 men. They eat at the hotel now." "Are they happy with the hotel food?" He almost smiled. About as happy as I was. Deb. The hotel's dining room served meals twice a day. Breakfast at 6 and supper at 6, and nothing in between. This was Calvin Reddick's policy, announced on a small chalkboard by the door, and it operated with the kind of rigid efficiency that confuses a system for a service. If you missed the window, you went hungry or you found something else. On the frontier, most people simply adjusted their hunger to fit the schedule. Because adjusting the schedule was not an option, Calvin entertained. Eliza learned all of this from Gerald Pruitt, who came by the kitchen on Wednesday morning ostensibly to see how she was getting on, and actually, she suspected because he was curious and lonely in the way of men who run general stores in small towns and know everything about everyone's business without being particularly close to any of them. He sat on a crate and drank the coffee she gave him. She'd traded 2 biscuits with Pete Garland for a small paper of coffee grounds, an arrangement that had seemed to surprise Pete with its practicality, and he told her about Hollow Fork the way people talk about a place they've lived in long enough to have complicated feelings about. "Calvin been here 11 years, Gerald said. Built that hotel in the second year. Before that, people were sleeping in the freight barn. He paused. That's this barn, actually. So he built the hotel, and he's been the main man since. More or less. He owns a piece of most things, not mine. He was careful to say this, the way people are careful when they want you to know their hands are clean. But the livery, yes, and the freight company majority, and the lots on the north end he's been holding for when the railroad talk heats up again. Does he always react that way to someone new? Gerald wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at the floor. He reacts that way to anyone he sees as competition, or anyone who might become competition. He's not, I don't think he's a bad man exactly. He just doesn't, he stopped. Doesn't what? Doesn't like things he didn't plan for. She thought about this. Outside, one of the freight teams was moving a wagon, and she could hear the particular controlled chaos of that. The creak of wheels, the shortness of the men's voices when they were working under load. He offered the kitchen for free, she said, in front of everyone. That was planned. Yes, Gerald said. He looked uncomfortable. It was. He expected me to fail in public. Yes. Quieter now. She nodded once, not with bitterness, just with the satisfaction of understanding something correctly. All right, she said. Good to know. Gerald finished his coffee and stood, and at the door he turned and said, For what it's worth, Miss Whitmore, those biscuits are the best thing I've eaten in about 4 years. He seemed almost embarrassed to have said it. Come back Thursday, she told him. I'm making stew. The stew was what changed things. Not because stew was unusual, but because the Thursday crew from Rawlins' direction, 8 men, as Elias had said, cold and road-soured and carrying the specific bad mood that comes from 2 days on a freight wagon in October wind, arrived in Hollow Fork at 3 in the afternoon, which was 3 hours after the hotel's breakfast service had ended and 3 hours before supper. They had 3 hours to wait and nowhere particular to wait in. Pete Garland found them at the livery and said something to them that Eliza was not present to hear, but which apparently involved the words beans and biscuits, and possibly don't miss it, because 20 minutes later there were 8 men standing outside her broken kitchen door in a line that looked, from a distance, like something organized. She had not planned for 8. She had planned for perhaps 4, maybe 5. The stew was good. She'd been tending it since morning, salt pork and potatoes, and the last of the dried beans with onion and a bay leaf she'd been saving since Cheyenne. But she had not made enough of it for 8 hungry men. She looked at the pot. She looked at the line of men. She made a decision. Come in, she said, but you'll be patient with me because I'm going to make this stretch. The heavy-set man at the front of the line, she'd learned his name was Virgil, that he'd been running freight between Rawlins and Hollow Fork for 6 years, that he had a wife and 3 daughters in Rawlins and thought about them every hour of every trip, looked at the pot, and looked at her and said, I've been eating trail food for 2 days. I'll be patient. She added water and 2 more potatoes from her diminishing supply and a handful of the dried herbs she'd brought from Cheyenne, because you always brought dried herbs. This was not negotiable, and she let the whole thing come back up to a simmer while 8 men sat on planks and crates, and in the case of 2 who couldn't fit inside, on the ground just outside the broken door, and she served them in turns, smallest portions than she'd wanted to give, but bigger than nothing, with biscuits she mixed and cooked while they waited. And the men ate in the particular silence of people who are concentrating on something that deserves concentration. Virgil, when he was done, put his bowl down on the plank and said, What do we owe you? She named the price. He looked at the man next to him, a sharp-featured man named Cole, who appeared to serve some function of second-in-command for the Rawlins crew, and something passed between them. We'll pay double, Virgil said. You don't have to do that. I know we don't have to. He said it plainly, without drama. But that's the best meal I've had since June, and I have a policy about paying people what things are worth. He put the coins on the plank, double what she'd asked, and Cole and the rest of the men did the same. She stood in the middle of the ruined kitchen with more money than she'd started the week with, and 8 freight workers arranging themselves back outside to get on with their day, and the stew pot scraped clean, and something sitting in her chest that was either triumph or just the sustained act of not falling apart, and she honestly wasn't sure which. Virgil paused at the door, the gap where the door would eventually be, once Elias finished it. We come through every Thursday, he said, and sometimes Mondays if the run changes. He looked at her directly, the way men look at you when they want to make sure they're being understood. "We'll be back." "I'll have enough next time," she said. He nodded, put his hat on, and walked back into the afternoon. She heard it from Pete Garland on Friday morning. He came in for his biscuits with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Cautious, slightly sideways, the expression of someone delivering news they're not sure how you'll take. "Reddick was watching yesterday," Pete said, "when the Rollins crew was here. She was mixing dough and she kept mixing it." "Was he?" "From across the street, stood at his window for a while, then came out and watched from the boardwalk." Pete paused. "He didn't look happy." "I imagine not." Doyle said he went back in and his face was— Pete searched for the word. "Tight, like he'd bitten something he hadn't expected." She shaped the biscuits and set them in the pan. The stove was working properly now. Elias had finished the top plate the previous afternoon, and the difference in heat distribution was measurable, the kind of thing you feel in the evenings when you're no longer cold on the side of you that's away from the fire. She had a door now, too, not pretty, as Elias had promised, but solid and hinged and capable of closing, which after 10 days was a thing she didn't take for granted. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," she said. "I know that. I'm cooking food. People are buying it. That's all." "I know that too." Pete turned his hat in his hands. He did this when he was thinking, she'd noticed, like the motion helped him arrange things. But Calvin Reddick doesn't think of it that way. He thinks of business like territory, you know? Like if someone's eating here, they're not eating at his place, and if they're not eating at his place, they're not under his. He likes people to need him. That hotel's the place everyone needs. It's always been. And now it's not the only place. Now it's not the only place. She slid the pan into the stove and closed the door. "Pete," she said, "thank you for telling me." He nodded, put his hat back on. "Just watch yourself is all." Bam. She did watch herself. But she was also busy, because busy was what she had instead of safe. By the third week, she had established a system. She cooked in the mornings for the freight crews, the same men now, reliable as weather, plus a few she hadn't met before, who'd heard from someone who'd heard from someone. She made biscuits every morning because they were fast and people wanted them. She made a hot meal at midday, whatever she could construct from her supplies, and another in the late afternoon for the crews coming through before the long evening. She kept her prices below the hotels. Not dramatically. She was not trying to undersell anyone into the ground. She was trying to make enough to keep going, just enough that the decision was easy. She bought more supplies from Gerald. She replenished the woodpile twice. She patched 3 more gaps in the walls with strips of old canvas she found in the barn, and the temperature inside the kitchen, which had been brutal in the first days, became merely cold, which was livable. Elias Boone came 4 mornings out of 7. Sometimes he had things to fix, a loose hinge, a problem she'd noticed with the way the stovepipe was drawing, and sometimes he just came and sat on a crate with a cup of coffee and talked about practical things in the way that practical people talk about them, which is to say directly and without sentiment. She learned that he'd come to Hollow Fork 7 years ago from Kansas, that he'd had a wife who died of fever in their 3rd year here, that he and Calvin Reddick had what he described as a working relationship, which she understood to mean they needed each other and didn't particularly like each other. "Does he know you're helping me?" she asked one morning. Elias wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "He knows." "And?" "He told me I was wasting my time. He said it without effect, the way you report weather. I told him that was my business." She looked at him. He was looking at the stove, checking the draw on the flue by the way the smoke moved. "Thank you," she said. "For that." "Didn't do it for thanks." "I know, but I'm saying it anyway." He made a small noise that might have been acknowledgement or might have been nothing and drank his coffee. The first time Calvin Reddick spoke to her directly since the night of her arrival, she was returning from Gerald's store with a sack of flour over one shoulder and a paper-wrapped piece of salt pork under her other arm. It was a cold morning with cloud cover that had been threatening snow for 3 days without committing to it, and she was watching the ground. The Main Street mud had developed the particular frozen and thawing texture that turned every step into a small problem. He fell into step beside her. She didn't hear him coming, which was intentional, she thought. "Miss Whitmore," he said pleasantly. "Mr. Reddick. I trust the kitchen is serving you adequately." She kept walking. The flour sack was heavy, and the crack in her boot sole had widened, and she could feel the cold coming through it. It's serving me fine. Good, good. He walked with his hands clasped behind his back, like a man taking a leisure stroll, except his eyes were doing something entirely different from leisurely. They were calculating. I've been watching your little establishment develop. I have to say I'm impressed you're still going. Were you expecting otherwise? I was expecting. He paused, as if choosing the word carefully, except she suspected he'd chosen it before he started this conversation. Difficulty. There's been plenty of that. And yet, he gestured toward the barn end of the street. You persist. She stopped walking and looked at him. He was smiling, as that same smile from the first night, controlled and confident, and meant to communicate that everything happening was within what he'd anticipated. But underneath it, there was something else. Not quite worry. More like the preliminary sensation of worry. The moment before a man admits to himself that something hasn't gone the way he planned. What is it you want to say, Mr. Reddick? He blinked once, very briefly. People who talked in circles often reacted that way when you short-circuited the circle. I want to say, he said, more carefully now, that this town has a certain equilibrium. Things have worked a certain way for a long time. I'd hate to see that disrupted. Things working a certain way, she repeated. You mean your dining room getting the custom? I mean the town having a stable foundation. She looked at him for a moment, then picked up the flour sack more securely and kept walking. My kitchen serves breakfast and midday and late afternoon. Your hotel serves 6 in the morning and 6 at night. There's 4 hours of the day between my last service and your supper when nobody's feeding anyone. I don't see the disruption. She felt him watching her walk away. She did not turn around. That evening, sitting on her floor with the stove at her back and her account book, a folded piece of brown paper where she kept her numbers, in her lap, she counted what she had. It was not a lot. It was more than 43 cents. It was more than she'd had at the end of any previous week. She was not safe. She had not even approached safe. But she was not failing, and failing was what he'd intended, and that distinction mattered to her in a way she couldn't entirely explain, the way some things matter not because of what they mean for the future, but because of what they mean about the past. All the kitchens, all the men who'd underestimated her, all the moments she'd stood very still and let the laugh wash over her, and then gotten up and gotten to work. The stove ticked. Outside, something moved in the barn, one of the freight horses shifting in its sleep. She put her account book away and thought about the Thursday crew and what she was going to make for them that would be different from last week, and better, and enough. Doyle came to find her on a Tuesday, which was unusual because Doyle was not a man who went out of his way for social calls. He appeared in the doorway of the kitchen in the late morning when she was alone and stood there with his hat in his hands and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something wrong? She asked. Not exactly wrong. He came inside, which also wasn't typical. Doyle usually stood in the door. He sat on a crate. Cruz heard something from one of the men at the livery. She waited. Reddick's been talking to the Rollins Freight Company. The owners, not the drivers. He set his hat on his knee and turned it slowly. Nobody knows exactly what was said, but the man at the livery said he heard something about routing changes. She felt the kitchen get very quiet. Routing changes, she said. Changing which road the Thursday run takes. Longer way around. Doesn't come through Hollow Fork. He was watching her carefully, the way a person watches someone when they're delivering information and want to see if it lands the way they expected. If that run doesn't come through here, that's 8 men a week you don't see. She was quiet for a moment. It's not certain, Doyle said. It's just what was heard. How reliable is the man who heard it? Reliable enough that I thought you should know. She nodded. She was standing at the work table, the plank she'd stabilized on 2 barrels, and she had her hands flat on it the way she sometimes stood when she was thinking. The wood was rough under her palms, unfinished, the kind of surface that left impressions in your skin. He can't change the road, she said finally. No, but he can make it easier for the company to choose the other one. There's money there, between him and the freight company owners. I don't know the exact arrangement. She thought about Virgil. We'll be back. Said it plainly, like a fact. Does Virgil know? I don't think so. Not yet. How long before a decision gets made? Few weeks, maybe. Month. She looked at the stove. At the solid seam Elias had repaired, the replaced top plate, the stone-propped leg that had somehow never given way. She looked at the door that closed now, that kept the worst of the cold out. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Doyle put his hat back on and stood up. At the door he paused, the way people paused in that doorway, and said without turning around, "He doesn't like that he can't predict you. That's the real problem." She didn't answer that. He left. She stood at the work table for a long time after he was gone, her hands flat on the rough wood, thinking about the difference between a problem and an obstacle. A problem was something that didn't have a clear solution. An obstacle was something in the way of a path that still existed on the other side of it. Calvin Reddick could influence a routing decision. He could make it expensive or inconvenient for the Rollins crew to come through Hollow Fork. He could apply pressure to the freight company in ways she couldn't directly counter. What he couldn't do was stop people from eating. And what he hadn't accounted for, what people like Calvin Reddick never accounted for, was that her customers were not loyal to a route. They were loyal to a meal. She needed more customers. Not just the Rollins crew, not just Pete and Doyle and the local men. She needed people from other directions, other routes, people for whom Hollow Fork was the destination rather than the waypoint. She needed the town itself. And the town had been eating at Calvin Reddick's hotel for 11 years. She picked up the flour sack and started measuring. The town would need a reason to come to the back of the freight barn instead of the front of the hotel. Reasons, she had found, were best made from scratch, the way everything worth making was made, from raw ingredients, with patience and heat and the willingness to wait for the thing to become what it was supposed to be. She had flour. She had patience. She had the memory of every kitchen she'd ever worked in, every meal she'd ever made from nothing. She started mixing. The flour she'd been measuring that Tuesday evening was still in the bowl the next morning when she came back to it, covered with a damp cloth the way her mother had taught her. You never waste a start, you just let it wait. And she stood over it in the gray pre-dawn light and thought about what Doyle had told her. She was not panicking. Panic was a thing she'd learned to recognize in herself, the way you learn to recognize the early stages of a fever. The particular quality of thought, the way every problem suddenly became both urgent and unsolvable simultaneously. She wasn't there. She was in the colder place before panic, the place where everything was still very clear and very difficult. Calvin Reddick was going to reroute the Rollins crew if he could. That meant she had somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks to make herself necessary to enough people in Hollow Fork that losing 8 men on Thursdays was a setback and not a finishing blow. The town's population was maybe 90 people, not counting the transient freight workers. Of those 90, how many were eating at the hotel? How many were cooking for themselves? How many might come to a kitchen behind a freight barn if they had a reason good enough to bring them there? She uncovered the flour and started working the dough. The reason, she decided, had to be something Calvin's hotel couldn't replicate. Not just better food, though she believed her food was better, with the particular quiet confidence of someone who has been cooking since they were 8 years old and has never seen a reason to doubt it. Something else. Something the hotel, with its chalkboard schedule and its rigid hours and its dining room that felt like sitting in a man's idea of what eating should look like, couldn't offer. She thought about the freight workers. She thought about the way they sat on her upturned crates and her salvaged planks in a room with gaps in the walls and a stove held up by a stack of flat stones, and ate in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable but was rather the specific silence of people who felt, for the length of a meal, that they didn't have to perform anything for anyone. The hotel had tablecloths. She'd seen them through the window once, passing, white linen, pressed, the kind of thing that makes a man in dirty work clothes feel like he's tracking mud somewhere he shouldn't be. She had no tablecloths and no intention of getting any. By 7 o'clock, she had biscuits in the stove, beans on, and a plan that was not fully formed but had enough shape to move toward. She needed to reach the people who didn't work freight, the women who cooked for their families and were tired, the older men who ate alone, the families who couldn't always afford the hotel prices, the people who existed in the spaces between the freight crews and Calvin Reddick's customer list. Pete Garland appeared in the doorway right on schedule, red scarf, cold hands, the expression of a man whose day would improve once he was warm. "Pete," she said while she was wrapping his biscuits, "do you know a woman named anyone in town who's having a hard time with cooking? Elderly, maybe, or unwell, or just—" She stopped because she wasn't sure how to finish the sentence without it sounding like charity, which she didn't mean, and which people on the frontier tended to respond to the way they responded to being pitied, which was badly. Pete thought about it. "There's the Marsh family," he said. "End of the North Road. Hector Marsh, he's been sick since September. His wife May's been running the farm and trying to keep the house, and I don't think they're eating great. Anyone else? Old Sutherland lives by himself above the tack shop. I think he mostly eats crackers." She thought about this. "Thank you," she said. He took his biscuits and went, and she stood at the stove and thought about how you reach people who don't come to you. She went to see May Marsh that afternoon, between the midday service and the late afternoon. She walked the North Road with her coat buttoned to the throat and the cold working at her face, carrying a covered pot of the bean soup she'd stretched that morning. The Marsh farm was small and looked like it had been trying very hard for a long time. May Marsh met her at the door. A woman maybe 15 years older than Eliza, with the kind of face that had been pretty once and was now something better than pretty, something more durable. She looked at Eliza and then at the pot with an expression that moved through several things quickly before settling on something that wasn't quite pride but was adjacent to it. "I heard about the kitchen," May said. She didn't open the door wider. "Don't need charity." "I know you don't," Eliza said. "I'm not offering charity. I'm asking a favor." May's expression shifted. "What kind of favor?" "I made too much this morning, and I need someone to take the extra. If I carry it back, it'll go to waste." This was mostly true. She had made extra, though not accidentally. "The soup's got salt pork in it, and I put a bay leaf in, which I know some people don't like, so if that's a problem, I won't bring it again." May looked at her for a long moment. Eliza held the pot and waited and didn't say anything else, because sometimes the most effective thing you can do in a silence is stay in it. "Bay leaf's fine," May said, and opened the door. Hector Marsh was in a chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket despite the fire, with the yellowish look of a man whose body was spending a lot of energy on internal problems. He nodded at Eliza when she came in and said, "Heard about you. Nothing bad, I hope. Heard you make a biscuit that almost made Pete Garland cry." He said this with a dry humor that suggested he'd been a man who found things funny before being sick had narrowed his field of available amusements. "Pete's a sensitive soul," Eliza said. Hector Marsh almost smiled. She left the pot and declined the offer of payment. The favor was letting me not carry it back, and walked back to town in the cold with the empty-handed feeling of someone who has just done something they're not sure was practical or sensible, but couldn't have done otherwise. She went to find old Sutherland above the tack shop on her way back. He was a small man with white hair and the particular smell of a bachelor who had been doing his own laundry for many years, which is to say an honest smell, not offensive but thoroughly without pretense. He opened his door and looked at her and said, "You're the cook woman." "I am." "What do you want?" "To bring you food twice a week," she said. "Morning meal. I charge the same as I charge the freight workers, which is less than the hotel. If you can't pay some weeks, you pay when you can." He stared at her. Why? She had thought about how to answer this on the walk over. She could have said any number of things. Could have talked about community, about people looking after each other, about the plain fact that a man eating crackers alone above a tack shop in a Wyoming winter was something that bothered her in a way she couldn't simply ignore. But she'd learned that plain honesty, offered without decoration, was usually better than any of those. "Because I need the town to know I'm here," she said, "and I can't afford to advertise, so I feed people and people talk." He looked at her for a moment longer, then stood back from the door. "Well," he said, "that's honest, at least. Come in." She came in and sat at his small table, and they talked. He talked mostly, which she suspected he didn't get to do often, about his years in Hollow Fork, about the way the town had changed, about Calvin Reddick building that hotel, and the way it had centralized things in a manner that not everyone had appreciated, but that most people had accepted because there weren't other options. "Always liked my independence," Sutherland said. "Don't like eating in a room where someone else decides when you eat." "No," Eliza said. "Neither do I." Word did travel, as she'd wagered it would. Not loudly. She hadn't expected loudness, but in the way that practical information moves through a small community, person to person, in the course of ordinary conversation. May Marsh mentioned it to the woman who came to trade eggs at her farm. Old Sutherland apparently told the man at the tack shop below him, who told someone else. By Friday, she had 3 new customers she hadn't had Monday. A carpenter named Webb, who worked at the north end of town. A young woman named Clara, who was new to Hollow Fork herself, and had been eating at the hotel out of default rather than preference. And a taciturn older man whose name she never caught clearly, but who paid promptly and ate everything she put in front of him and came back the next day. The kitchen was getting full. Not full the way Calvin's dining room was full, not with tablecloths and the performance of respectable eating, but full the way a kitchen gets full when people feel like they're welcome in it, which is a different kind of full entirely, less orderly and more alive. She was running low on supplies. She'd been calculating carefully, spending only what she took in, building the small reserve she kept in a tin box under the floorboard near the stove with the kind of discipline that came from having had nothing and knowing exactly how fast nothing could return. But the volume of cooking was outpacing what she could buy in small quantities from Gerald. She went to Gerald on a Friday and asked about bulk pricing. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man doing arithmetic. "For flour," he said slowly, "if you're buying a 50-pound sack at a time, I can come down some. Beans, too." He pulled at his thin beard. "I should tell you," he said, "that Calvin came in Monday and bought up most of my flour stock." She went still. "How much of it?" 300 pounds. Said he was expecting increased demand. Gerald's eyes met hers, then slid away. "I've got about 70 pounds left." "Will you be getting more?" "My next supply order comes through in 3 weeks. I've put in for extra." He paused. "Calvin knows when the supply wagon comes. He's done business here a long time." She stood at Gerald's counter and let this settle into place alongside what Doyle had told her about the routing change. 2 moves. One against her supply chain, one against her customer base. Done quietly, without confrontation, in the way a man who has been operating a business for 11 years knows how to do things. Not dramatically, but effectively, through the practical levers of commerce. "Can I put in an order to be filled when your next shipment comes?" she asked. "Before it arrives." "In writing." Gerald looked at her. "You mean before Calvin can come in and buy it first?" "I mean, I'd like to secure my order in advance." He thought about this for a moment, and she watched something move in his face. The calculation, but also something else, some small private decision. "Yes," he said. "I can do that. I'll write it down today." "Thank you, Gerald." "He's going to know," Gerald said quietly. "He pays attention to everything." "Let him," she said. Elias was at the kitchen when she returned, which was not one of his usual days. He was sitting on a crate with a cup of cold coffee. She hadn't banked the stove before she left. And he stood when she came in with the supplies she'd bought. "The stovepipe's pulling wrong," he said, by way of explanation for his presence. "I noticed this morning. Give me 20 minutes. She rebuilt the fire while he worked on the pipe joint, and they were in the same comfortable parallel silence they'd developed over the weeks when he said, without looking away from what he was doing, "Calvin bought Danielson's flour." She looked up. "Danielson's?" "Over in Pine Ridge. That's the closest other general store, 18 miles east." He made a small adjustment to the pipe. "Cole from the Rollins crew told me this morning. Calvin sent a man out there last week." She put her hands flat on the work table. 2 moves she'd known about. Now 3. He'd gone to the secondary supply source before she could even think to. "How did Cole know?" she asked. "Cole's cousin works at Danielson's." Elias glanced at her. "Word gets around." "Does Calvin know I've pre-ordered from Gerald?" "Probably by now." He made the final adjustment and stepped back. "That'll do." He looked at the pipe, then at her. His face was difficult to read. It always was, built for concealment not by design but by long habit. But there was something in it that she'd come to recognize as concern, stripped of anything resembling drama. "He's coming at the supply chain because he can't come at you directly. The people buying from you, he can't stop them choosing, but he can make it so you don't have anything to sell." She knew this. She'd been sitting with it since Gerald's store. "If I can't get flour in 3 weeks," she said slowly, "what can I cook without it?" He thought about this seriously, because Elias Boone took practical questions seriously. "Potatoes are still coming in from the farms east of here. Cole's people would have them. Maymarsh has a root cellar, I'd imagine." "I'd need more than I can buy from Gerald." "I know some of the farmers," he said. Quietly. Not offering exactly, just placing the information where she could reach it if she wanted to. She looked at him. Elias. I've got relationships from the smithing. People bring me their equipment. We talk. He picked up his tools, began packing them. I can ask around, quietly. She thought about the 10-meal arrangement, the deal they'd made in the first week, which she'd satisfied and then some, which had slid naturally into something else, something she hadn't named because she wasn't sure what to name it. He came because he came. He helped because he helped. She had stopped trying to calculate what he was getting out of it, not because she didn't wonder, but because the wondering seemed to cost him something, some ease in the arrangement, and she'd decided the arrangement was worth more to her than the accounting of it. Thank you, she said. He waved this away in the way he always waved off thanks, like it was a gnat, and went back to his coffee, which she reheated for him, and they sat in the kitchen while the stove worked its way back up to temperature and the afternoon light shifted in the cracked window, and she started planning what she could make without flour, if it came to that. It was on a Wednesday, 12 days after Doyle's warning, that she first heard the thing that shifted the whole situation. The carpenter, Webb, came for his midday meal and ate with the particular speed of a man who had to be somewhere afterward, and as he was standing to leave he said, almost as an afterthought, "Heard Virgil came through town yesterday." She looked up. On a Wednesday? Not with the crew. Alone. Had a meeting with Calvin at the hotel. Webb shrugged the way men shrug when they know something is significant but don't want to appear too interested in it. Saw them through the dining room window when I was passing. She said nothing. Figured you'd want to know, Webb said, and left. She stood at the work table for a long time. Virgil. At the hotel. Meeting with Calvin on a Wednesday, a week before the Thursday run, alone and without the crew. It could mean many things. It could mean the routing conversation. It could mean Calvin making his case directly to the man who led the crew, offering some inducement, a reduced rate at the hotel, a business arrangement. Virgil had a wife and 3 daughters in Rawlins. A man with a family was a man who could be offered things and calculated about those things. She thought about Virgil's face when he'd said, "We'll be back." She thought about the double payment, about Cole's matter-of-fact loyalty. She thought about the way some promises were structural, made not from sentiment, but from repeated experience, from knowing where you could count on a thing. But she also thought about money, and what money could move. She needed to talk to Virgil before Thursday. He came on Thursday as usual, arriving with the crew at just past 3 in the afternoon, and she watched for the moment before the general noise of 8 cold men arriving took over. She caught his eye at the door and tilted her head slightly, the way you communicate across a room when words aren't possible. He came to the back of the kitchen while the crew settled. "I heard you had a meeting with Calvin Reddick," she said quietly, not accusingly, just directly, because direct was the only register she trusted. Virgil was quiet for a moment. He took off his hat. He offered the crew a room rate at the hotel. 3 months, reduced price, for the Rawlins men on their Thursday stop. And he suggested the long route might have some advantages I hadn't considered. Better road maintenance on the South Pass in winter. His jaw moved. He was polite about it. Of course he was. Virgil looked at her. He was not a man who was easy to read, but she'd had practice. The months with the trail outfit had taught her to read working men, to understand the geography of their faces when they were deciding something. What she saw was not betrayal. What she saw was a man who had been made an offer and was still holding it, turning it over, feeling its weight. "The room rate is real money," he said. "Over a winter, it adds up." "I know. I'm not telling you I'm taking it. I'm telling you what it is." "I know that too." She kept her voice level. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The South Pass Road. Has it actually been maintained?" He paused, just a fraction. He said it had been. "Has anyone checked it?" Another pause, longer this time. "Not that I know of." She nodded. "Okay." She looked at the crew, who were already eating. Doyle with his bowed head concentration, Pete talking to Cole about something, the usual theater of men at the end of a long day who have found something warm to sit near. "I want you to eat first," she said, "and then I want to show you something, pets." What she showed him, after the crew had eaten and the kitchen had settled into the particular loud quiet of satisfied men, was her account book, the folded brown paper, opened flat on the work table. She'd written things out more carefully in the past week, knowing she might need this conversation. "I started with 43 cents, she said, This is what the past 5 weeks have produced. He looked at the numbers without touching the paper. His face was neutral and doing arithmetic. It's not a lot, she said. Not compared to a hotel room rate, I know that. But this is 5 weeks from nothing, with a cracked stove and no door. She paused. In 3 months, on the same trajectory, this is where it goes. She showed him the projection she'd done. Conservative, the way her mother had taught her to project. Assume less than you hope for. Plan for the shortfall. Virgil looked at it for a long time. He's trying to cut my flower supply, she said. You probably already know that, or some version of it. I heard something. He bought up Gerald's stock in Danielson's in Pine Ridge. My next order from Gerald comes in 11 days. She folded her hands on the table. I'm not asking you to do anything that doesn't make sense for your crew. I'm asking you to verify the South Pass Road before you make a decision about it. That's all. He looked at her. You know why he's doing all this. Because I'm taking his business. Because you're taking it without trying to. He said this almost carefully, like it was something he'd thought about. There's a kind of man who can accept a competitor who fights him. He can understand that. He can fight back. It's a thing he knows how to do. But a woman behind a freight barn who just starts cooking and people just start coming... He stopped. He doesn't have a move for that. He's finding moves, she said. Yes. He put his hat back on. I'll check the South Pass Road before I make any decisions. And I'll ask Cole to check with his cousin at Danielson's about the flower situation. He looked at her steadily. That's what I can tell you right now. That's enough, she said. He went back to his crew and she began clearing the meal, stacking the bowls she'd acquired one at a time over the weeks, chipped, mismatched, each one from a different place. And she thought about the South Pass Road and whether Calvin had actually done the maintenance or whether he'd simply said he had, and she thought that the answer to that question was probably the answer to several others. The flower situation arrived before the supply wagon. On a Monday morning, 9 days before Gerald's expected shipment, she opened her flour tin and found she had perhaps 4 pounds remaining, enough for 2, maybe 3 more days of biscuits at current volume. After that, she'd need to adapt the menu, which she'd been planning for, except that adapting the menu meant telling her customers the menu was changing, which meant explaining why, which meant the story of Calvin buying the flour supply would become public in a way it currently wasn't. She was considering this at the work table when the kitchen door opened and a woman she didn't know came in without knocking. She was perhaps 50, sturdily built, with the kind of dark hair going to gray at the temples that suggested she'd stopped worrying about it some time ago. She wore a working dress and heavy boots and carried a sack over one shoulder that clinked in the way that suggested glass jars. "You're Eliza Whitmore," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I am. I'm Ruth Calloway. My husband works the farm 4 miles south of here." She set the sack down on the work table without ceremony. "May Marsh told me about you, said you've been good to her and Hector." Eliza looked at the sack. "What's in that?" "Preserved goods. Tomatoes, mostly. Some pickled vegetables." Ruth looked around the kitchen with the frank assessment of a woman who has run her own kitchen for a long time and has opinions about kitchens in general. "May also told me about the flour situation, the business with Reddick." "News travels fast," Eliza said, for the second time since coming to Hollow Fork. "Small town," Ruth said, exactly as Elias had. "I've got flour at the farm. Winter supply, more than we need this year, on account of we put in extra. I'll sell you 20 pounds at cost, not markup." She paused. "And my sister-in-law has a working relationship with a supply merchant out of Cheyenne who doesn't go through Danielson's." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" Ruth looked at her with the expression of someone who considers the question slightly beside the point. "Calvin Reddick has been the only game in town for 11 years, she said. "I ate in that dining room twice a week until a month ago. Do you know what they served last Tuesday?" "No." "Cold potatoes and something that was supposed to be gravy." She picked up her sack. "The jars are a gift. The flour will settle on price. And I'll write to my sister-in-law today if you want me to." Eliza looked at this woman who had walked into her broken kitchen on a Monday morning with preserved tomatoes and a supply contact and the plain-spoken efficiency of someone who had decided what she thought and was acting accordingly. "Yes," she said. "Please write to her." Ruth nodded, put the sack down properly this time, and sat on a crate. "Now," she said, "show me what you do with tomatoes." The twist came on a Thursday, the same day as everything else seemed to happen in Hollow Fork. Virgil arrived with the crew at 3 in the afternoon, as always. But this time he arrived 20 minutes before the crew, alone, and he came to the kitchen with an expression that was not his usual working man's neutrality. Something had resolved in his face, the way weather resolves after a long period of indecision. "The South Pass Road," he said. "Yes?" "Cole sent a man out Wednesday to look at it." He sat down on the crate Virgil always used, which had become, without anyone deciding so, his crate. "It hasn't been touched in 2 years. There's a section past the Second Creek crossing that's bad enough to lose a wagon in bad weather." She said nothing. "Calvin Reddick told me that road had been maintained," Virgil said. His voice was even, controlled, the way working men keep their voices when they're angry about something, and are not going to make a scene about it, but are also not going to pretend they aren't angry. "He told me it to my face, as a fact." He paused. "It was not a fact." The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. "He lied to you," Eliza said. "Yes." The word landed like a piece of iron. "He lied to me to get me to reroute the crew through a road that would have saved him competition and possibly wrecked one of my wagons in January weather." He looked at his hat, which he was turning in his hands the way Pete did when he was thinking. She'd noticed it was a common gesture among men who worked with their hands. "I've been doing business in this territory for 14 years. My reputation is my wagons arrive. If I take a road someone told me was safe and it's not—" He stopped. "That's not a business lie, costing me everything I've built." She let this sit for a moment because it needed to sit. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "We're staying on the Hollow Fork route." He put his hat on with the particular finality of a man making a decision official. "And I'm going to have a conversation with the freight company owners about what kind of suggestions they've been receiving and from whom." He looked at her. "Cole's already written to his cousin at Danielson's. Turns out there's been pressure there too. Payment for first refusal on the flour before it goes out to any other buyers." "He was building a wall," she said quietly. "He was." Virgil stood up. "The crew's coming. What are you feeding us today?" She looked at the stove, at the pot she'd been tending since morning, at the 20 pounds of Ruth Calloway's flour on the shelf. "Potato soup," she said, "and biscuits." "Good." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Miss Whitmore." He turned halfway. "I've been in business a long time, and I've dealt with men like Reddick before, men who think the whole board is theirs to arrange." He paused. "They're usually right, until they meet someone they didn't plan for." He went outside to wait for his crew. She stood at the stove and stirred the soup and felt the heat of it come up and the weight of the past several weeks, the cold floors, the cracked window, the 43 cents, the laugh on the main street. All of it at once, not dramatically, but the way things accumulate when you've been carrying them for a while and then set them down briefly to see what they weigh. The crew arrived loud and cold and hungry, and she served them, and the kitchen was full in the way she'd come to love it being full. Imperfect, crowded, smelling of potato and salt pork and wood smoke. And when Calvin Reddick walked past the end of the freight barn, on his way somewhere in the late afternoon light, what he would have seen, had he looked, was a window glowing warm in a kitchen he'd given away as a joke. She did not look up to see if he was watching. She had soup to serve. The evening came down cold over Hollow Fork, and in the kitchen behind the barn, 12 people ate a meal that cost almost nothing to make and meant more than any of them said out loud. And the fire in the old stove with its repaired seams and its propped-up leg and its cracked top plate burned steady and hot, the way things burn when someone has taken the trouble to keep them going. The supply wagon arrived on a Tuesday, 8 days after Ruth Calloway had walked into the kitchen with her preserved tomatoes and her plain-spoken efficiency, and 2 days after Gerald had sent word that the shipment was coming early on account of the weather forecast looking bad for the following week. Eliza was there when it pulled up. Not because she'd planned to make a point of it, she had better things to do with her mornings than stand in the street, but because she'd been at Gerald's store returning a borrowed crate when the wagon came around the north end of the main road, and she stayed. Calvin Reddick was there too, within minutes. She didn't see him arrive, but she heard the change in the air, the way you hear a door open in a quiet room. The particular shift in the quality of attention on the street that meant someone significant had appeared. I was wearing his good coat, which she'd come to understand was what he wore when he was conducting business. He considered important, and he walked to Gerald's door with the unhurried pace of a man who fully expected to be first. Gerald came out to meet the wagon driver, and Calvin moved to intercept him, and Gerald said something Eliza couldn't hear from where she was standing, and Calvin's pace slowed by half a step, just half, barely perceptible. And he said something back, and Gerald reached into his apron pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. Calvin looked at the paper. His face did not change in any dramatic way. It was more like watching a clock stop. The same expression, continued, except that whatever had been moving behind it had ceased to move. Gerald had honored the pre-order. Calvin turned and looked at the street, and his eyes found Eliza with the precision of a man who had already known she was there and was simply completing the motion of looking. She held his gaze for a moment and then went back to Gerald's store to pick up her flour. Inside, Gerald was already unstacking the new goods from the back shelves, and he looked at her sideways as she came in, and said nothing, and she said nothing, and she paid for her flour and her additional supplies and carried them out the back way. She didn't feel triumphant exactly. She felt like someone who had just watched a structural thing happen, a weight shift from one side to another, and understood that the shifting was not finished, but had definitively begun. The consequences arrived in stages, the way consequences usually do when the person engineering them is too careful to act from anger. First, the rent notice. It appeared under the kitchen door on a Thursday morning, slid underneath while she was at the water barrel, written on hotel stationery in a hand she didn't recognize but suspected belonged to Calvin's man of business, a thin person named Arch who handled the paperwork side of Calvin's various arrangements. The notice stated that the monthly fee for the kitchen space was being adjusted, effective the 1st of next month, to an amount that was precisely twice what she currently paid. She read it twice, set it on the work table, went back to making biscuits. Pete found her in the same state he always found her, working, slightly floury, and she showed him the notice without comment. He read it, and his jaw tightened. He can, she said. It's his property. It's barely a property. It's a broken room attached to a barn. It's his broken room. Pete put the notice down. What are you going to do? She'd been asking herself the same question since she'd read it, turning it over the way she turned dough, looking for the places where it was uneven, where it needed more work. The doubled rent was aggressive, but not impossible. Not yet. She'd built up enough in the tin box under the floorboard that she could absorb it for perhaps 2 months, 3 if she was careful, while she looked at other options. But 2 or 3 months was not a solution. It was a delay, and she suspected Calvin knew the arithmetic of her situation better than she'd have liked. I'm going to pay it, she said, for now. While you figure something else out. While I figure something else out. She handed him his biscuits, and he sat on his crate and ate them with the focused silence of a man who was thinking about something and didn't want to share it prematurely, and she let him think because she knew the value of letting people arrive at things in their own time. He finished the second biscuit and said, without looking up, My uncle owns a lot on the south end of town, near the creek. He's been trying to get rid of it for 3 years. She looked at him. It's not much, he said quickly. There's nothing on it except some old foundation from whatever was there before. But it's a lot, and my uncle wants rid of it, and I think if you talk to him... He stopped, turned his hat in his hands. I don't know what you could afford. I don't know if it makes sense. I wanted to say it. She thought about the tin box under the floorboard. She thought about the supply contact from Ruth's sister-in-law in Cheyenne, which had produced its first order. Smaller than she'd hoped, larger than nothing, at prices better than Gerald's, though she would never tell Gerald this because she still needed Gerald and didn't want him to feel replaced. She thought about the Callaway farm flour and Virgil's crew on Thursdays, and old Sutherland, who now came to the kitchen 3 mornings a week and sat at the plank table and talked about everything and nothing while she cooked, and the quiet way the town had started to rearrange itself around the fact of her kitchen. Tell me about the lot, she said. She went to see the lot that afternoon. Pete's uncle was a man named Pharaoh, who was large and slow-moving in the way of men whose bodies have done 30 years of heavy work and arrived at a truce with the idea of doing less of it. He walked her to the south end of town with his hands in his pockets and showed her the lot, which was exactly as Pete had described, nothing but old foundation stone and Wyoming wind, and named a price that was low enough to suggest he meant it about wanting rid of it. She stood on the lot and looked at the foundation. It was good stone, she noticed. Whoever had built here before had known what they were doing with the base, even if the rest of it was long gone. The lot faced east, which meant morning light. The creek was 50 yards to the south, close enough for water access, far enough not to be a problem in spring flooding. "What was here before?" she asked. "Smithy," Pharaoh said. "Years back. Man who ran it left when the silver talk died down, took what he could carry." He squinted at the foundation. "Stone's still good." She thought about money. She thought about what she had in the tin box and what she needed to keep in reserve and what was left over, and whether what was left over was enough. The answer was almost. Almost, but not quite, if she paid the property in a lump, which she suspected Pharaoh preferred. "Can we talk about terms?" she said. "Not all at once." Pharaoh looked at her. He was not a complicated man, she thought. Not simple, but not complicated either. The kind of man who trusted his gut about people and had the experience to know his gut was usually right. "Monthly," he said. 6 months. Miss one, and we renegotiate." "Agreed," she said, and put out her hand, and he shook it with a hand that felt like a leather tool. She walked back to the kitchen in the late afternoon with the lot papers folded in her coat pocket, which Pharaoh had produced from somewhere in his house, with the offhandedness of a man who'd had them ready for some time. And she tried to do the arithmetic in her head, and then gave up and waited until she was back at the work table with her folded brown paper account book spread out. The numbers were tight. They were always tight. But they were moving in one direction and not the other, and the direction they were moving was forward, which was the only direction she had any interest in. She told Elias about the lot that evening. He came in late, unusual for him. He was generally a man of reliable hours, with a cut on his left hand wrapped in a cloth that was already showing through, and the look of someone who'd had a long day that hadn't gone the way he'd intended. She made him unwrap the hand and looked at the cut. "How did you do this?" "Chisel slipped." He said it with the impatience of a man who considered the injury beneath discussion. "It needs to be cleaned." "It's fine." "Elias." He let her clean it. She had a small kit, basic things, the kind of supplies you carry when you live in places where a doctor is 3 hours away. She worked carefully, and he sat still, which was its own kind of patience, and she noticed that his hands, close up, showed years in ways his face didn't quite. The scarred knuckles, the burn marks from the forge, the particular thickness of skin that comes from work that is demanding and doesn't care whether you're ready for it. "I bought a lot," she said while she was wrapping the cut. He was quiet for a moment. "South End." Word really does travel fast. Pharaoh told his neighbor. His neighbor came to the shop. He looked at his hand, which she had now wrapped securely. "You're planning to build." "Eventually, when I have what I need." She sat back down at the work table across from him. "The doubled rent buys me time to plan, but not forever. If I'm going to have a real kitchen, it needs to be mine." "Building takes money." "I know." "And time. Spring at the earliest if you break ground when the frost goes." "I know that too." He turned the wrapped hand over, looking at the bandaging. "Foundation on that lot is good stone," he said. "I've looked at it a few times. Always thought someone should do something with it." She looked at him. "You've looked at it. Drive past it going home." Neutral tone, very controlled neutral tone. "Elias, you don't live on the South End." A pause. "I go that way sometimes." She let this sit for a moment, because there were things she could say, and things that were better left in the comfortable indirection where they currently lived, and she had become, over the past 2 months, fairly skilled at knowing which was which, with Elias Boone. "I might need someone who knows construction materials," she said, "when it comes to building. Someone who understands iron and structure." "I might know someone like that," he said. His face did the thing it sometimes did. Not quite a smile, the architecture of one. And he picked up his coffee. They sat in the kitchen with the stove between them and the night coming down outside and the town settling into its evening sounds. And she worked on her account book while he drank his coffee, and the cut on his hand bled through the bandage slightly, but neither of them mentioned it again. The second move Calvin made was subtler than the rent notice and considerably more damaging. She learned about it from Clara, the young woman who'd been eating at the kitchen since the first weeks, who had taken a job at a boarding house that had opened on the west end of town, and who had a gift for being in rooms where things were said and remembering what she'd heard. Clara came in on a Friday morning looking like someone who'd been awake since before light and had something to deliver. The freight company owners, she said. The ones in Rawlins. Eliza set down what she was doing. What about them? Calvin sent them a letter. I don't know exactly what it said, but Mae Marsh's neighbor, her husband does the sorting at the postmaster's office, and he didn't read it, but he saw the address and the name on the envelope. Clara stopped, took a breath, organized herself. The letter was to the company owners, and 2 days later there was a letter back to Calvin. And the day after that, Virgil got a letter from the owners. What was in Virgil's letter? I don't know, but Virgil came into the boarding house where I worked to ask if there was room for the crew, long term, which there isn't, the boarding house is too small, but he was asking. Eliza thought about this. Virgil asking about long-term accommodation meant he was planning extended stays, which meant the Rawlins to Hollow Fork run was still happening. That was good, but something in the way Clara was telling it. There's something else, she said. Clara nodded. The letter from the owners to Calvin. The postmaster's husband said there was a seal on it that looked like… He described it, and I think it might be the same seal as the Territorial Commerce Office. A beat of quiet. He brought in the Commerce Office, Eliza said. I don't know for certain. It might be nothing. It might be someone else's seal entirely. Clara looked at her steadily. But I thought you should know what was being sent. After Clara left, Eliza stood at the work table and thought about the Territorial Commerce Office, which she knew about in the way that frontier people knew about administrative bodies, as distant presences that mostly didn't affect daily life until they did, suddenly and entirely. The Commerce Office had authority over business licensing, property use, and a number of other things that she had not previously considered particularly relevant to a woman cooking beans and biscuits behind a freight barn. She thought about what a man like Calvin, with 11 years of established business and established relationships, and the kind of connections that came from both, could do with an administrative body and a complaint about unlicensed commercial food service. She went to find Gerald. Well, Gerald knew about licenses. Of course he did. He'd been running the general store for 8 years and had acquired, over that time, the kind of comprehensive working knowledge of commercial regulations that a man gets when he cannot afford to get them wrong. He pulled out a folder from behind his counter when she explained what she was worried about, and he went through it with her in the careful way he had, not rushing, not minimizing. You need a commercial kitchen license from the county, he said. If you're selling food to the public on a regular basis, it's… He found the relevant page. It's required within 60 days of beginning commercial operation. How long have I been operating? About 8 weeks. She did the arithmetic. She had perhaps a week, maybe 2, before the 60-day window closed if someone decided to make a formal complaint. And the Territorial Commerce Office, if involved, would not be interested in her extenuating circumstances. How do I get the license? She asked. County seat. Lander. Gerald folded the papers carefully. It's a 2-day ride. I can't close the kitchen for 2 days. No. He looked at her over the top of the folder. But you could send someone. She thought about who she could send. She thought about who in this town would take 2 days out of their life to ride to Lander on her behalf, and what it would cost, and whether she had what it would cost. She thought about Virgil. What? Virgil said yes before she'd finished explaining. He said it the way men say things when they've already considered the question and are just waiting for it to be asked. I've got business in Lander anyway, he said. I can add this to it. I know the clerk at the county office. We've dealt with freight licensing for years. He paused. You'll need to write down everything, what you're operating, where, for how long, how many people you serve. The documentation has to be specific. She spent that evening writing it all out. The kitchen dimensions, the number of customers per day, averaged over 8 weeks, the type of food service. She wrote it in her careful, plain hand, the way she wrote everything, without flourish, without apology, with the precision of someone who has learned that vagueness costs you. Elias sat across from her while she wrote and drank his coffee, which had become a thing so ordinary she'd stopped marking it. At one point he said, When does Virgil leave? Sunday. How long for the county office to process? Gerald said 2 weeks, maybe 3. Elias nodded. He looked at the account book, open on the table. She hadn't closed it when he came in. He didn't ask to look at it, but she slid it slightly toward him, and he looked at it for a moment and slid it back. Tight, he said. Yes. But manageable. Yes. She said it without a great deal of certainty, because certainty about money was a thing she'd long ago stopped performing. If nothing else happens, something else will happen, he said. There's always something else. That's not encouraging. I'm not trying to encourage you. He drank his coffee. I'm telling you the truth, which is that something else will happen and you'll deal with it the same way you've dealt with everything else. He set the cup down. That is encouraging. You just don't recognize it when it's not wrapped in comfort. She looked at him. He was looking at the stove. She went back to writing. The something else arrived sooner than she'd expected, and from a direction she had not anticipated, and it had nothing to do with Calvin Reddick. Hector Marsh died on a Tuesday in the first week of November. May sent word through Pete, who came to the kitchen in the early morning with his red scarf and his hat in his hands, and the particular quietness of a man who has been asked to deliver bad news and has been carrying it carefully. He told her simply, and she stood at the stove and felt the particular weight of it. Not grief exactly, not for a man she'd known only 8 weeks and spoken to perhaps 4 times, but something in the adjacent territory. The weight of knowing that someone who had been alive and speaking was not anymore, and that the person left behind was alone in a farmhouse 4 miles north with a root cellar full of food she'd put up herself and the very long days of a Wyoming winter still ahead. She packed a basket, salt pork, potatoes, 2 jars of Ruth Calloway's preserved tomatoes, a sack of flour, 4 apples she'd been saving, and a crock of the apple butter she'd made the previous week from the end-of-season apples Ruth had brought by. She packed it carefully and carried it to the North Road. The farm was quiet when she arrived. The kind of quiet that settles after something has happened, and the practical business of it, the sending of word, the arrangements, has been handled, and what's left is just the fact of it, sitting in the house with the person who has to live with it. May came to the door when she knocked and looked at the basket and said nothing for a moment. I don't need, she started. I know you don't need it, Eliza said, but I made too much apple butter and someone has to take the extra. May looked at her. Her face was dry. She had been crying earlier. Eliza could see the evidence of it, but was not crying now. Was in the practical stage that follows, the stage where you are dealing with things, because the alternative to dealing with things is not acceptable. She opened the door wider. Eliza came in and put the basket on the table and sat down without being asked, because sometimes the thing a person needs is someone who will sit down without needing to be invited, without making a ceremony of deciding to stay. She sat and May sat across from her and they talked. Not about Hector, not directly, not yet, but about the farm and the winter and the root cellar and the practical considerations of what came next. And Eliza listened in the way she'd always listened, with the full attention she'd discovered people rarely received and valued more than they let on. After a while, May said, He liked your soup. I know, he told me the one time I was here. He didn't say things like that easily. A pause. He said it tasted like the kind of cooking his mother used to do, before everything... She stopped. Before things got harder. Eliza looked at her hands on the table. That's the thing about food, she said, when it's made right. It remembers things. They sat in that for a moment. What will you do? Eliza asked, carefully. Through the winter. May looked at the window, the farm outside, the bare fields, the sky going gray with the kind of clouds that meant snow within the week. I've been running this place since September, she said. I know how to run it. She said it not with defiance, but with the matter-of-fact clarity of a woman who has been competent for a long time and has accepted that competence is sometimes lonely. I'll run it. If you need anything, Eliza said. Not charity, just if you need. May nodded once. Same, she said. If you need. The walk back to town was cold, the wind coming from the north now with serious intention, and she thought about Calvin Reddick the whole way back. Not obsessively, not with the kind of energy that spending time on your enemies costs, but practically, methodically, the way she thought about difficult meals. What did she have? What was he working with? Where was the gap between them? He had money and history and relationships and an administrative body potentially in his pocket. He had the ability to make her operations more difficult and more expensive. He had the kind of power that came from being in a place for 11 years and building up the weight of obligation and dependency around him, like walls. What she had was a kitchen that people wanted to be in, a crew of freight workers whose loyalty he'd lost the moment he'd lied to their leader about road conditions, a woman with preserved tomatoes who had a sister-in-law in Cheyenne, an old man who ate crackers and now came to the kitchen 3 mornings a week, a carpenter named Webb, a young woman named Clara who noticed things, a blacksmith with a replaced knee who came in on days that weren't his days and looked at lots he didn't live near and fixed things without being asked. She thought about what Virgil had said. They're usually right until they meet someone they didn't plan for. She was the someone nobody had planned for. She had been the someone nobody planned for her whole life, and she had learned, slowly, over years, across dozens of kitchens and 100 variations of the same dismissal, that being unplanned for was not a weakness. It was the most specific kind of freedom available to a person that the powerful had decided wasn't worth watching. But the news from Lander came on a Thursday, 17 days after Virgil had ridden south. He arrived with the crew as usual, but he came to the kitchen before the others, the way he always did when he had something to say, and he put a folded paper on the work table. She opened it. The county seal at the top. Her name. The kitchen address. The words Commercial Food Service License, approved in the plain administrative hand of someone whose job was to make things official. She looked at the paper for a moment. The clerk was efficient, Virgil said, knew what he needed and processed it fast. I may have mentioned that there was some time sensitivity to it. He paused. I may also have mentioned who was creating the time sensitivity. She looked up. You told him about Calvin. I told him that there was pressure coming from an established businessman who had financial relationships with several Commerce Office contacts, and that a small operator was potentially being squeezed out through administrative process rather than fair competition. He said this evenly, without drama. The clerk is a methodical man. He doesn't like the administrative process being used as a weapon. It offends him professionally. She looked back at the license. The paper was slightly crumpled at one corner, the mark of a 2-day ride in a coat pocket. She smoothed it on the work table. How much do I owe you? She asked. The filing fee was $3. I paid it. He held up a hand before she could respond. You can settle it when you're settled. I'm not worried about $3. I worry about $3, she said. I know you do. That's why you're going to be all right. He turned to go join his crew. One other thing, he said, stopping at the door. The freight company owners wrote to me. They've been made aware of the South Pass Road situation and the fact that Calvin provided me with false information about its condition. They are, he chose the word, displeased with him, not with me. What does that mean for his relationship with the freight company? It means that the freight company will no longer be responsive to suggestions about routing changes from Calvin Reddick. A pause. It also means that a man who built a significant portion of his business influence on a relationship with the freight company owners has lost that relationship. He left to join his crew, and she stood at the work table with the license in her hand and felt the room shift around her. Not dramatically, not the way rooms shift in stories where the hero finally wins and everything becomes clear. More like the way a structure settles when the pressure on one side of it eases. Not fixed, not finished, just different. The problem had a different shape than it had yesterday, and she was going to have to look at it with fresh eyes and figure out what that shape required. She put the license up on the wall. She didn't have a frame for it. She'd never owned anything that required framing, so she tacked it with 2 small nails into the plank wall above the work table where she could see it while she cooked. Then she went back to making soup because the crew was hungry and there was still work to do. She heard about Calvin Reddick's situation from 3 different people over the following 2 weeks, which meant it was real and not rumor. First from Gerald, who said that 2 of the freight company's long-term contracts with the Reddick Hotel, the use of Calvin's stable facilities for overnight freight storage, had been quietly terminated. The freight company had found alternative arrangements with the livery on the north end, which Calvin did not own. This removed a significant portion of monthly income from Calvin's operating base. Then from Clara, who had been told by the woman who managed the hotel's laundry that Calvin had let go of 2 of his 4 staff. The dining room was operating with the skeleton crew. The reduced staff meant reduced service hours, which meant the hotel's famous 6 and 6 schedule was now 6 in the morning and nothing reliable in the evening. Then from old Sutherland, who heard things from the man below him at the tack shop, who heard things from everyone who came in to buy leather goods, which was nearly everyone in Hollow Fork at one point or another. What Sutherland reported, in his dry and careful way, over a cup of coffee at Eliza's kitchen on a cold Wednesday morning, was that Calvin Reddick had not been seen at the Main Street businesses for 4 days. His man Arch is handling everything, Sutherland said. including the hotel operations, which, he paused, is apparently not going well because Arch is a paperwork man and not a hospitality man, and the difference shows. Have you heard anything about Calvin specifically? Eliza asked. Where he is? In the hotel. Sutherland turned his coffee cup on the plank. Word is he hasn't been well. She thought about this for a moment. What kind of not well? Nobody knows exactly. His man won't say. Sutherland looked at her with the clear-eyed assessment of a man who has lived long enough to watch a lot of situations develop. The kind of not well that happens to men who've been running very hard for a long time and then lose the thing they were running toward. She said nothing. He's alone up there, Sutherland said. Arch goes back and forth, but Arch has his own arrangements. The hotel's it's not a place where anyone's inclined to be generous right now, not after everything that got known. He drank his coffee. People in small towns have long memories, Eliza, for the people who wronged them, and for the people who didn't. She looked at the stove. The fire was steady. The soup was doing what soup does when you give it enough time and the right amount of attention, becoming better than the sum of its ingredients. Outside, the first real snow of the season was coming down. Not the teasing, uncommitted flurries of the previous weeks, but actual snow, the kind that meant winter had made its decision and was sticking to it. The main street would be a different thing by nightfall, muffled and reorganized the way snow reorganizes everything. She thought about a man alone in a hotel room in the first real snow of a Wyoming winter. She thought about what it cost to be that, and whether anyone who hadn't been alone in a cold room had the right to consider it a judgment rather than a condition. She served Sutherland his second cup of coffee and went back to her soup and let the thought sit where it was, unresolved, for now. The snow that had started falling on Wednesday did not stop until Friday morning. By Thursday evening, Hollow Fork was the kind of quiet that only heavy snow produces. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended, as if the town had agreed collectively to pause whatever argument it had been having with the season and simply wait. The main street was buried past the boardwalk edges. The freight barn had a foot of snow on its roof that Eliza could hear settling in the night, a slow, creaking weight. The kitchen, with its patched walls and its solid door and its stove that Elias had made right, held its heat better than she'd expected, better than it had any right to, given what it was. She had been thinking about Calvin Reddick for 2 days. Not continuously. She had a kitchen to run and supplies to account for, and the particular logistics of cooking in heavy weather, when the water barrel froze at the surface and the woodpile needed constant attention, and the customers who came through the door brought half the outdoors in with them on their boots and their coats. She had things to do. But between things, in the spaces where thought goes when your hands are occupied and your mind is briefly free, she kept returning to what Sutherland had said. He's alone up there, the kind of not well that happens to men who've been running very hard for a long time and then lose the thing they were running toward. She had not forgotten what Calvin Reddick had done. She was not capable of forgetting it, and she would not have trusted herself if she'd claimed otherwise. The public humiliation, the flour supply, the lie about the South Pass Road, the rent notice, the administrative pressure through the Commerce Office. These were not small things. They were the calculated actions of a man who had looked at her and decided she was an obstacle to be removed, not a person to be considered. Each one had cost her something: sleep, money, the particular tax of having to plan around someone else's malice when you are already working at the edge of your capacity. She knew all of this. She held it clearly. And she still couldn't stop thinking about a man sick and alone in a hotel room while the snow came down. This was the thing about herself she'd never fully made peace with, the part of her character that was inconvenient and sometimes costly, and that she'd tried to reason out of herself on multiple occasions without success. She did not have the ability to stop caring about people's suffering just because they had earned it. It wasn't virtue. She didn't experience it as virtue, didn't feel righteous about it. It was more like a design flaw she'd been born with and learned to accommodate. Her mother had been the same way, had fed people who had been unkind to her, had brought food to neighbors who had said cutting things about the Whitmore family's circumstances, had explained it simply when Eliza was old enough to ask, "I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it because of who I am." Those are different things. Eliza hadn't fully understood that distinction until she was in her 20s. She understood it now. On Friday morning, when the snow had stopped, and the sky had that particular clean emptiness that follows a long storm, she made a pot of soup. She'd been making soup for 2 months and had gotten very good at reading what a pot needed. This one she made with more salt pork than usual, and the last of Ruth Calloway's preserved tomatoes, and a quantity of dried herbs she'd been rationing since October. She made biscuits alongside, 2 dozen, and wrapped a portion of both in cloth and in the piece of oilskin she kept for exactly this purpose. Elias came in while she was packing it and looked at what she was doing and said nothing for a long moment. "He's sick," she said, before he could ask. "I know. He has no one up there to bring him anything proper." "I know that too." Elias sat down on his crate. His knee was worse in the cold. She'd noticed him favoring it more severely over the past 2 weeks, though he never mentioned it, and she never pushed. "You don't have to explain yourself to me." "I'm not explaining myself. I'm telling you where I'm going." "There's a difference?" She looked at him. He was looking at the stove, the way he looked at the stove when he was actually thinking about something else entirely. "Do you think I shouldn't?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to deflect. Then he said, "I think you already know what you're going to do. I think you came to that decision 2 days ago, and you've been waiting to see if anything would talk you out of it." He picked up his coffee. "Nothing's talked you out of it." "No," she said. "Then go." He drank. "I'll watch the kitchen." She stopped at the door. "You don't have to. Pete'll be here in 20 minutes. Clara comes at 9. Between us, we can manage biscuits and coffee for 2 hours. He didn't look at her. "Go before you talk yourself into a longer conversation about it." She went. The walk to the hotel was short and long at the same time, the way walks are when you're moving towards something you're not entirely sure of. The main street after the snow was transformed, the usual mud and chaos replaced by a white evenness that made everything look temporary, like a draft of the town rather than the town itself. Her boots punched through the surface crust with each step, and the cold came through the crack in the left sole, which she'd been meaning to do something about for weeks and hadn't. She went in the hotel's front door because the front door was the only door she'd ever used here, and she wasn't going to change that now. Arch was at the front desk, the thin man, Calvin's man of business, who looked at her over a ledger with the expression of someone who has been expecting a problem and has now located it. "Miss Whitmore," he said, flat, careful. "I've brought food for Mr. Reddick," she said. "Is he in his room?" Arch looked at the oilskin-wrapped bundle in her arms. Something moved in his face. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of what had been there before. A slight dissolution of the professional guardedness. "He's in his room," he said. He's not been well." He hesitated. "The doctor came Wednesday, said it's a lung inflammation. He needs rest and—" He stopped. "He hasn't been eating much." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." Arch looked at her for a moment. She couldn't tell what he was thinking, and she didn't try. He came around the desk and led her up the stairs. The hotel's upper floor was quiet, in the way of places where the ordinary activity has thinned out. 2 of the 4 room doors she passed were open onto empty rooms, the lost staff, the reduced occupancy. Arch stopped at the end of the hall and knocked at a door that was closed. A sound from inside, weak but present. Arch opened the door and stepped back, and Eliza went in. Calvin Reddick was in his bed, which was a good bed in a well-furnished room. The best room in the hotel, she understood without being told. The one he kept for himself. He was propped against pillows, a blanket pulled to his chest, and he looked reduced in a way that had nothing to do with size. He was the same size. But something that had been operating at full pressure when she'd seen him before. Something that ran in his face and his posture and the way he held himself when he walked, was at low ebb, and the effect was startling even to someone who had reason to find it satisfying. He looked at her for a moment. Whatever he'd expected, it was not her. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was rough, abraded by the inflammation. "Mr. Reddick." She came in properly and set the bundle on the table beside his bed and began unwrapping it. She did not ask permission. She did not make a speech about why she was there. She simply unwrapped the soup and the biscuits and found the small bowl she'd packed inside the bundle and ladled soup into it and set it where he could reach it. He watched all of this without speaking. She pulled the chair from the corner of the room. A good chair, solid, the kind of furniture a man buys when he wants people to know he has money for good furniture, and sat down with the posture of someone who intends to stay long enough for this to matter. "You don't have to be here," he said. I know. After everything, he stopped, coughed, which seemed to cost him, and she waited for it to pass. You don't owe me anything. The reverse. Yes, she said. The reverse. He looked at the soup. Why then? She thought about her mother's answer and decided it was too neat for this room, too packaged. Calvin Reddick didn't need a tidy explanation. He needed soup. Because it was the right thing to do, she said, and I try to do the right thing even when it's inconvenient. I'm not always successful. She paused. But I try. He picked up the bowl. His hands, she noticed, had a slight tremor. Not age, she thought, but illness and possibly something else. The particular unsteadiness of a man whose body has been refusing to cooperate with his intentions for longer than he's admitted. He took a spoonful of soup and held it in his mouth for a moment, the way people do when they've stopped expecting things to taste like much. He took another spoonful. She let the silence run. She was good at silence. She had built 2 months of a life inside the tolerance for it. After a while, he said, Virgil. Not a question, just the name. Yes, she said. The freight company. Yes. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming an accounting he's already done in private. The Commerce Office clerk. Virgil handled that one. Efficient man. He said it without bitterness, which surprised her. More like acknowledgement. The South Pass Road. She said nothing. He set the bowl down, half empty, which was more than he'd been eating, she suspected, and looked at the window. Outside, the snow lay still on the rooftops and the street below, clean and indifferent. I lied to him, Calvin said. About the road. Yes. I've been in business for 20 years, he said. In that time I have done... He paused, the pause of a man doing an internal inventory that is taking longer than expected. I have done a number of things I could argue both sides of. Sharp dealing, pressure, buying advantage where I could find it. He looked at his hands. I have never told a man a road was safe when I knew it wasn't. Not before. He was quiet. I don't know quite what happened when I looked at you in that kitchen and those men choosing it instead of... He stopped. I became something I don't fully recognize. She looked at him. She believed him, not because she was inclined to trust him. She was not, and might not be for a long time, but because the voice of a man performing honesty and the voice of a man actually practicing it have different textures, and she'd heard enough of both to know the difference. You wanted to control what you couldn't control, she said, and you went further than you should have. Yes. Simple, direct. People could have been hurt, she said, Virgil's crew, on a road you told them was safe. I know. He looked at her. I know that. I've been lying here for 4 days knowing that. She let this sit for a moment, because it needed to sit, because the weight of a thing only registers if you give it the space to land. Get well, she said finally, and when you're well, figure out what you do with knowing it. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not quite vulnerable. Calvin Reddick was not a man who went to vulnerable easily, and she suspected he never fully would. But open, in the way of someone who has been stripped of the performance they've been running and is momentarily exposed to air. I'll send Arch with payment for the food, he said. His voice was steadier now. Something in having said the things he'd said had done something structural to him. Don't worry about that now, she said. I'll send Arch, he repeated, quietly firm. The first thing in this conversation that had sounded like the man she'd dealt with before, except stripped of everything that had made him dangerous. I'll pay what's owed. That much I can do. She recognized this for what it was. Not grand gesture, not reformation, but a small specific act of repair, the kind that is within a person's power right now and not dependent on a future version of themselves. She had learned to value these. The small specific acts were usually more honest than the large ones. She stood and gathered the wrapping cloth, left the soup, the biscuits, enough for the evening and the next morning. I'll bring more Monday, she said, because he was going to need more, and because she was going to bring it regardless of whether she said so, and saying so was simpler than pretending otherwise. He didn't thank her. She didn't need him to. At the door she paused, the way people paused at that threshold, the habit of doorways, and said, "The hotel's dining room. When you're back on your feet, you should think about what you're serving in there." He looked at her. "Cold potatoes and bad gravy," she said. "I've heard. You used to run a good operation. That's what people said before things changed." She met his eyes. You could run a good operation again. Just run it like you're building something, not guarding it. She left without waiting for a response. The walk back through the snow felt different from the walk there. Lighter in the way of having set something down you've been carrying, though she couldn't have named exactly what she'd been carrying or precisely what she'd set down. Not forgiveness. That was too large a word for too complicated a situation. Not closure. Things were not closed. More like she had gone and done the right thing, and it had not cost her what she'd feared it might. And Calvin Reddick was a man with soup and something to think about, and that was enough for a Friday morning. Elias was at the work table when she returned. Pete had been and gone. Clara was at the corner with coffee and old Sutherland, who had apparently arrived while Eliza was out, and had made himself comfortable in the way he'd developed over 2 months of morning visits, which was thoroughly and without self-consciousness. Elias looked at her when she came in. She hung up her coat and went to check the stove. "How was it?" he asked. "Hard," she said. "And fine." He nodded. That was enough of a report for both of them. But December came in with cold that had opinions about it, the kind of cold that made everything structural. Every decision about wood, about food, about heat, feel consequential in a way that summer cold never did. The kitchen was warm. That fact, which had felt miraculous in October, felt ordinary now in December, and Eliza knew that the shift from miraculous to ordinary was how you measured whether something had become real. The lot on the south end was under snow, but she'd walked it twice in the weeks before the heavy weather came and stood on the old foundation stone and thought about what could be built on it. Elias had walked it with her once, in the particular way he had of examining things. Not talking much, just looking, running a hand along the stone at one point, checking its integrity the way you check the integrity of a stove seam. He'd said, "This'll hold anything you put on it," and then walked the perimeter dimensions, and she'd watched him mentally building something she hadn't yet asked him to build. She asked him on a Thursday evening in December, 3 days before the first Christmas of her time in Hollow Fork, when the kitchen was cleaned and the day's customers were gone, and the stove was banked for the night, and they were the last 2 people in the room. "In the spring," she said, "when the ground thaws, I want to build a proper kitchen on that lot, a real structure, with a real stove and room for a table that isn't planks on barrels." He was quiet for a moment. "How many people do you want to seat?" 20, maybe 25? "That's a significant building." "I know." "You'd need a foundation crew, a framing crew, materials from somewhere." "I've been in contact with Ruth Calloway's sister-in-law in Cheyenne. There's a merchant there who deals in building supplies alongside dry goods." She looked at him steadily. "And I know a blacksmith who understands structural iron." He looked at the stove, at the solid seam he'd made in the first week, at the repaired top plate and the stone-propped leg that had never, in 3 months, given way. "I'd need to know the dimensions you want," he said. "I'll draw them out." "And what you're budgeting for the ironwork." "I'll show you the account book." He nodded once, slowly, with the finality of a man who has considered something and arrived. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she said. She drew him a cup of coffee, and they sat at the work table in the light of the banked stove, and she pulled out the brown paper account book, and they began talking about dimensions. Arch came to the kitchen on a Saturday with an envelope, as Calvin had said he would. Inside was payment for the soup and biscuits, and more besides. Eliza looked at the amount and looked at Arch. "He said to consider the excess a debt paid on account," Arch said, with the precision of someone delivering a message very carefully. He looked around the kitchen, the patched walls, the solid door, the license tacked above the work table, with an expression that was hard to read, not cold but complicated, the expression of a man who has served a complicated person for a long time and is still in the process of deciding what he thinks about that. "He also said," Arch paused. "He asked me to tell you that the hotel's supper service will be restructured in January. New menu. He's brought on a cook from Rollins, who was recommended by Virgil." Eliza looked at him. "Virgil recommended the cook?" "Yes." She thought about this. Virgil, who had been deceived by Calvin, who had brought the weight of the freight company's displeasure down on him, who had ridden to Lander on her behalf. Virgil recommending a cook to the hotel that had tried to use him as a weapon against her. "The frontier is a small world," she said. "It is," Arch said. He put his hat on with the correctness of a man conducting business. Miss Whitmore. He left. She put the envelope in the tin box under the floorboard. The tin box was heavier now than it had been in October. Not heavy in the way of security. She was not yet in the territory of security, might not reach it for years, but heavy in the way of progress, of movement, of the ongoing accumulation of what honest work produces when you give it enough time. Calvin came to the kitchen on a Tuesday in the last week of December. He came through the main street, not the barn side, which meant he walked past the front of the freight operation and around the corner in full view of anyone on the street. This was intentional, she understood. He was a man who understood visibility, who had always understood it, and he was choosing to be visible in a specific way. He was thinner from the illness and moved with a slight carefulness that hadn't been there before, like a man who has been reminded of his own fragility and is still negotiating what to do with the reminder. He came to the door of the kitchen, her door, the one Elias had made and hung, solid and plain, and he knocked, which was also intentional. He could have walked in. He knocked. She opened it. He was carrying something. She didn't see it at first, then realized 2 dishes, covered, stacked carefully in his arms. Good dishes. The hotel's dishes. White with a blue rim, the kind you noticed when you sat in the dining room. I had the new cook make something, he said, as I wanted to bring something. He looked briefly like a man who has rehearsed what he was going to say and has now forgotten it completely, which was the most human she had ever seen him look. A contribution to your table, since you contributed to mine. She stepped back from the door. He came in. The kitchen was mid-morning quiet. The busy breakfast service done, the prep for the midday not yet begun. Old Sutherland was in his corner with his coffee and looked at Calvin with the frank assessment of a man his age who has stopped pretending to have diplomatic instincts. Reddick, Sutherland said. Sutherland, Calvin said. He set the dishes on the work table. He looked around the kitchen, really looked, the way he hadn't the first time he'd been here, hadn't needed to then, had known it was a broken room and hadn't looked further. He looked at the stove, at the license on the wall, at the mismatched bowls stacked on the shelf and the herbs hanging to dry and the rough planks and the barrel tables that were still the main seating, though she'd added 2 proper chairs in November. You've done a great deal, he said, with very little to start with. I had a stove, she said, and flour. You had 43 cents, he said. Gerald mentioned it. He was quiet for a moment. I want to say, I know that an apology for what I did is worth approximately what you'd decide to value it at, which given the circumstances might be very little. I'm not going to make a speech about it. He turned and looked at her directly. What I did was wrong. Not just the specific things, the flour, the rent, the road, the fundamental thing, looking at you and deciding you weren't worth taking seriously. He paused. That was the first wrong. Everything else came from it. She looked at him. He held the look without flinching, which she gave him credit for. I'm not going to tell you I've forgiven you, she said. That's not something I can promise right now. It might come. It might take a long time. She put her hands flat on the work table in the way she did when she was saying something she meant completely. But I believe you mean what you're saying, and I think that counts for something. He nodded once, small, precise, the nod of a man accepting terms he cannot improve. Sutherland made a sound into his coffee that might have been approval or might have been indigestion. With Sutherland, it was sometimes hard to tell. Calvin uncovered the dishes. Inside was something that smelled, she leaned slightly, like a beef and vegetable preparation, well seasoned, with the particular depth that came from a long braise. He'd brought bread too, a loaf, still warm. The cook's name is Martha Haynes, he said. She came from the Rollins Hotel before Virgil's company changed their contract with them. She's very good. Virgil has good instincts about food, Eliza said. Yes. A slight pause. I'm learning that his instincts about other things are equally reliable and that I should have paid more attention to that earlier. She covered the dishes again to keep the heat in and looked at him. Sit down, she said. I'll make coffee. He sat. On the crate, Pete's crate, which Pete had vacated an hour ago. Calvin Reddick sat on an upturned crate in a kitchen behind a freight barn and folded his hands on a plank and barrel table, and Eliza made coffee on a stove that had been broken when she arrived and was solid now, and old Sutherland regarded the whole scene with the satisfaction of a man who has lived long enough to see things turn out in ways he hadn't predicted. They drank coffee. They talked, not easily, not with the comfort of people who have known each other well, but with the careful attention of people who are starting something new on difficult ground and know it. He asked about the lot on the south end. She told him about the building plan. He listened the way he'd never listened before, without calculating what it meant for him, without looking for the angle, just listening. Martha Haynes has opinions about kitchen design, he said. If you'd ever want, she's practical about it. She might have useful thoughts. I'd be glad to talk to her, Eliza said. She meant it. She was surprised, slightly, to mean it. But she had always been better at meaning things than at finding reasons not to. January settled over Hollow Fork like a long sentence being finished. The cold was serious and unironic, and everyone dealt with it in the specific personal ways that people develop for dealing with conditions they cannot change. More wood, heavier clothes, shorter trips between warm places. The particular endurance of people who chose to live somewhere that tested them every winter and returned to do it again. The kitchen behind the freight barn was the warmest public space in town. This was not planned. It was a consequence of Elias's work on the stove and the walls, of the woodpile she'd maintained with almost religious consistency, of the accumulated heat of cooking several meals a day for 3 months. People came for the food and stayed for the warmth, and talked to each other in the way people talk when they're in a place that allows it. And the kitchen became what kitchens become when they work properly, the center of something. Mae Marsh came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She had developed, in the months since Hector's death, a particular self-sufficiency that sat on her differently than it had before, less armored, more chosen, as if she'd discovered that being capable and being alone were two different things, and she'd decided to be the first without being required to be the second. She and Ruth Calloway had become what Eliza thought of as friends in the working sense, the kind of friendship that develops between women who respect each other's practical competence and don't require a great deal of ceremony around it. They sometimes came together and sat at opposite ends of the plank table and talked across each other while Eliza cooked, a comfortable, overlapping conversation that required no particular management. Elias came 6 mornings out of 7 now. He had stopped pretending this was about stove maintenance, or at least had stopped offering it as an explanation, which amounted to the same thing. He came and drank coffee, and sometimes helped with things that needed 2 people. The heavy lifting, the repairs that still occasionally surfaced, and sometimes just sat and read what he had to read or thought what he had to think. And the kitchen accommodated this because the kitchen had learned to accommodate people who needed to be somewhere without needing to explain why. She thought about this sometimes, about what the kitchen had become versus what she'd planned for it. She had planned for a business. She had built a business. The numbers in the tin box, now moved to a proper locked box Gerald had found for her, confirmed that. But she had also, without quite intending to, built something that didn't have a name on the ledger. The kind of place where old Sutherland could sit in his corner and feel like a person who mattered to the day. Where Pete Garland could come in cold from a night run and find something hot without having to ask for it. Where Mae Marsh could sit across from Ruth Calloway and talk about practical things in a language that assumed competence and didn't offer pity. She hadn't planned for that. She'd arrived with 43 cents and a plan for survival, and somewhere between October and January, it had become something larger than survival, which was, she supposed, what happened when you stopped trying to manage everything and just kept showing up and doing the work. In February, when the worst of the winter was technically past, but the cold hadn't yet received the news, the building materials arrived from Cheyenne. She'd finalized the order in January through Ruth's sister-in-law, a woman named Della, who ran a dry goods and materials operation with the kind of organized ferocity that made Eliza feel immediately fond of her. The lumber was good quality. The iron Elias needed came separate, specified by him in a list that was precise to the 1/4 inch, written in the neat square hand of a man who had been doing technical work his whole life and had stopped apologizing for caring about accuracy. Eliza stood on the south lot the day the materials arrived and watched the wagon being unloaded and thought, this is real. Not in a sentimental way. In the way that something becomes real when it has weight and dimension and a place in the physical world, when it is no longer a plan in a brown paper account book, but lumber stacked on a foundation and iron waiting to be shaped. Elias stood beside her and looked at the lumber with the expression he reserved for things he was going to make into other things. "We break ground when the frost lifts," he said. "That's 6 weeks, maybe 8. I know. It'll take all spring to build properly. You won't be in it until summer at the earliest." "I know that too." He looked at her sideways. "You're not worried about it." "I'm not worried about it," she said. "I'm worried about money and time, and whether the kitchen in the barn holds until then, and whether the stovepipe needs replacing before spring, and whether I've been ordering enough of the dried beans." She paused. "I just don't spend the worry on the building. The building is going to happen. I'm not uncertain about that." I was quiet for a moment. "You weren't certain about any of it in October," he said. "No, but I was committed to it. There's a difference." She looked at the foundation stone under the snow. The good stone Pharaoh's previous occupant had laid down and left for whoever came next. Being certain and being committed aren't the same thing. You can be committed to something you're not at all certain about. Sometimes that's the only honest way to be committed. He looked at her with the look she'd catalogued over 4 months. The one that wasn't quite a smile, but contained everything a smile contains. "That's true," he said. "I know it is," she said. "I've been practicing it since October." There is a thing that happens to people who are underestimated for a long time, if they survive it with themselves intact. It is not triumph exactly, though there are moments that look like triumph from the outside. It is something quieter and more durable than triumph. It is the specific knowledge of what you are made of, acquired not from success, but from the sustained act of continuing. When continuing was difficult, when the stove was broken and the flour was gone, and the man across the street was using every lever available to him to make you stop. Eliza Whitmore had that knowledge now in a way she hadn't had it in October, or rather she had it differently, not as a belief about herself, but as a demonstrated fact. She had been tested in specific ways and had not broken. She had been cold and short of money and publicly humiliated and bureaucratically pressured, and she had continued, not because she was exceptional, not because she was without fear or doubt, but because stopping was not something she could make herself do when there was still a way forward, however narrow. This was the thing nobody told you about resilience. It wasn't grace. It wasn't strength in the heroic sense. It was mostly stubbornness and the willingness to be uncomfortable for longer than the situation wanted you to be. It was getting up off the floor, which had been literal more than once in that first month, and going back to the stove. She thought about this sometimes when she looked around the kitchen and saw what it had become. The people in it, the warmth of it, the small, dignified ecosystem of mutual reliance that had assembled itself around a woman making food in a broken room. She thought about her mother, who had fed people her whole life and had never owned a building or secured a license or faced down a man like Calvin Reddick, but who had understood the fundamental thing, that a kitchen, made right, is never just about food. It is about who you are in relation to other people. It is about what you choose to offer when the world has offered you very little. Her mother would have liked Hollow Fork, she thought, would have liked Mae Marsh and her matter-of-fact grief and her competence, would have liked Old Sutherland and his crackers-to-soup trajectory, would have liked Virgil, who paid double and checked roads and rode to Lander, would have liked Elias, probably most of all, for reasons Eliza could articulate but chose not to. The building went up over the spring, as Elias had projected, with a crew of 4 that included Pete Garland's Uncle Pharaoh and a young man named Daniel, who had arrived in Hollow Fork in March looking for work, and turned out to be good with timber framing, and Elias himself, who managed the ironwork with the focused intensity of someone doing the thing they are specifically made to do. It was not a smooth construction. There were problems with the framing in week 3, a calculation error in the window placement that required a day of corrective work, a delivery from Cheyenne that arrived short on 1 grade of lumber and required substitution. Elias and Eliza argued once, genuinely argued, about the height of the ceiling in the main room. He thought her specification was ambitious for the budget, she thought his revision was short-sighted for the purpose, and they went back and forth about it with the directness of people who have established enough trust to disagree without managing each other. She got the ceiling height she wanted. He got a structural reinforcement he'd wanted that she'd initially thought was unnecessary. Both of them were right about different things. By June it was standing, a real structure on good stone, with a proper stove that Elias built from the iron he'd specified. with a chimney that drew clean and a floor that didn't have gaps and windows that had actual glass and a main room that seated 24 at proper tables. She moved the license from the wall of the freight barn kitchen to the wall of the new building on a Tuesday morning in June, the last week before she opened. She carried it carefully, still in the same slightly crumpled condition from its journey in Virgil's coat pocket, the corner still bent. She smoothed it and tacked it on the new wall, above the new work table, in the same position it had occupied in the barn. Elias watched this from the doorway. "You could get it framed," he said. "It's been on a wall long enough to deserve a frame." She looked at the license, at the county seal and her name, and the words that had mattered so much when they arrived. "Maybe later," she said. "Right now it looks right the way it is." He came in and stood next to her and looked at it with her. The new kitchen smelled of fresh lumber and iron and the particular clean smell of an unused stove, waiting. "You know what this is," he said. Not a question exactly. "A kitchen," she said. "A kitchen," he agreed, and then quietly, "and something else." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. She went to the stove and opened the firebox and began the first fire. Calvin Reddick came to the opening in the second week of June with Martha Haynes beside him, a compact, capable woman of about 50, with the hands of a working cook and the direct manner of someone who has been competent too long to be impressed by pretense. Martha looked at Eliza's stove with the professional assessment of a woman evaluating a piece of equipment, and then looked at Eliza and said, "Elias Boone built this." "He did. He built my oven at the hotel, too, years back." She pressed her hand against the iron surface the way you test temperature. "He knows what he's doing." "Yes," Eliza said, "he does." Calvin stood at the center of the room and looked around at the tables, proper tables now, 8 of them, with chairs that didn't wobble, in a room with a ceiling high enough that the space breathed, and at the people filling them, freight workers and farmers and townspeople, and Mae Marsh and Ruth Calloway and Old Sutherland in his corner, which he had claimed immediately upon arrival with the proprietary confidence of a man who considers the concept of corners a personal right. Virgil was there, arrived early with Cole and 2 others from the Rollins crew. Pete Garland was there. Clara. Webb the carpenter. A family she didn't know well yet, who had moved to Hollow Fork in the spring and had been eating at the kitchen in the barn for 6 weeks. It was not a grand occasion. She had not made it a grand occasion. She had opened the door and started cooking, which was the only kind of opening that made sense to her. Calvin looked around the room for a moment, and then looked at her. "You did something here," he said, and then, "I'm sorry it took me this long to say that without it costing you something." She handed him a bowl of soup. "Sit down, Mr. Reddick," she said. "You're letting the cold in." He sat. At a table with Virgil, which was either accidental or deliberate, and probably a little of both, and they talked. She didn't hear what they talked about. She was working, she was always working, with the particular careful civility of men who have wronged each other in an accounting that is still being settled and have decided to settle it at a table over something hot. Elias was at the work table, not at a customer table, because he was Elias, and this was the position he'd always preferred. Close to the work, slightly removed from the crowd, useful. She handed him a bowl without comment, and he took it without comment, which was their language, as established and sufficient as any other. She moved through the room and served people and spoke to people and watched the room fill with the particular sound she loved best, which was not silence and not noise, but the layered human sound of people who are somewhere they want to be, talking and eating and not having to be anything other than what they are. Outside, the June sun was doing what it does in Wyoming in the early summer, which is everything at once, hot and clear and enormously present, as if making up for the months it had been gone. The main street of Hollow Fork ran past the window, and she could see the hotel across the way, and the livery, and Gerald's store, and the freight barn where she had started. The broken room she'd started in was still back there, behind the barn. She'd swept it clean when she moved out, packed her things carefully, closed the solid door Elias had made for it, left the plank tables and the barrel legs and the mismatched bowls she didn't have room for, because the next person who used that room might need them. Someone had left her things once, scraps of wood, a broken stove, a room with gaps in the walls, and she had made something of it, and it was right that the room wait for whoever came next with similar needs and similar stubbornness. She thought about October, about the mud and the coin counting and the laugh on the street, and the moment she'd stood in the broken kitchen and decided she was going to light the stove. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known then, and decided it wasn't much. She'd known enough in October. She'd known how to work, and how to wait, and how to cook, and how to be decent to people even when decency was inconvenient. That had been enough. That had been, in the end, everything. She went back to the stove and put the next pot on. The room kept filling, the soup kept going, the fire burned steady and clean in the iron stove that Elias had built on the foundation that someone else had laid down and left for her. Outside, Hollow Fork went about its June afternoon, ordinary and ongoing and entirely indifferent to the fact that something had changed inside it, changed the way real things change, without announcement over time, through the accumulated weight of small choices made by imperfect people who kept showing up anyway. She had not saved the town. She had not intended to save anything. She had come with 43 cents and her mother's skillet and a plan for getting through the next week, and then the week after, and then the one after that. The town had done the rest itself, the way towns do when someone gives them a place to be human in. She stirred the pot and called to Pete to open the window. The room was warm enough now, warm enough for June, and listened to the sound of people eating, and she was, in the way of people who have worked very hard for something real and arrived at it without quite realizing the moment of arrival, entirely and imperfectly at home.